Hello, everyone. Tonight we're going to begin with totally wrong medieval facts everyone still believes. So before you get too comfortable, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft hum, and let's step into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the myth that refuses to die the Middle Ages as an era of flat earth panic, with monks peering over the edge of the ocean, terrified of tumbling into the abyss. It's a neat image. It is also wrong. Medieval scholars inherited a spherical earth from the ancient world and, crucially, kept teaching it. The chain runs clear. Aristotle argued for a globe. Hellenistic astronomers refined the picture. And in the 3rd century BCE, Eratosthenes measured Earth's circumference using nothing more than shadows, a well, and geometry. That demonstration, simple, elegant, unforgettable, echoed through late antiquity into medieval classrooms. By the 13th century, students across Europe were reading a slim and wildly influential textbook called De Sphaera Mundi, on the sphere of the world. Its author, John of Sacrobosco, did not write a treatise on flat plates and cosmic waterfalls. He explained a round Earth in a round cosmos, and his notes were copied, glossed, argued over, and memorized for centuries. The curriculum of cathedral schools and early universities, places founded and funded under church charters, rested on the assumption that you live on a sphere. Sailors did not need a university to see it. On a clear day at sea, the world reveals its curve. Distant ships do not vanish all at once. First the hull disappears, then the masts. Landfall works the same way in reverse. A bell tower rises over the horizon, then roofs, then the low stone of a harbor wall. In an eclipse, Earth casts a curved shadow on the moon. No matter where you stand, ordinary observation, repeated by generations, turned the globe into common sense long before there were sextants and chronometers. Even art carried the message. Medieval painters placed an orb, the orbis terrarum, in Christ's hand, a tiny globe topped with a cross to signal dominion over the world. Kings and emperors posed with the same symbol, not a frisbee, not a platter, but a sphere. The great mappae mundi, those circular maps of the world that look like puzzles to modern eyes, were not failures of cartography. They were theological diagrams that arranged salvation history and known geography in a single view. Their roundness was metaphysical, but it still lived inside a spherical earth. So where does the flat earth Middle Ages come from? From a much later a story about the Middle Ages. In the 19th century, polemical writers eager to paint the medieval past as benighted and themselves as enlightened reached for easy contrasts. One of the most durable came from a best-selling work that romanticized Christopher Columbus as a lone genius defying superstitious clerics who believed the earth was flat. It makes for rousing drama. It also misplaces the argument. Columbus's critics did not say the world was flat. They said his world was too small. Here the numbers matter. Classical and medieval authorities generally used a circumference close to the true value. Columbus trimmed it. He read an Arabic astronomer in a Latin translation and may have confused miles for miles, taking a longer Arabic mile as a shorter European mile and squeezed the globe until Asia slid toward Spain. In other words, he thought the voyage to the Indies across the Western Ocean would be much shorter than it is. Without the Americas, his fleet would have sailed into a dangerous emptiness with provisions gone and courage spent. His gamble succeeded because there was an unsuspected landmass in the way. Not because he disproved the shape of the world. There is another reason the myth clings our habit of equating medieval with backward. When we walk through a dimly lit gallery of manuscripts, it's tempting to see darkness and call it ignorance, but the light level protects pigments. It does not measure intellect. The people who drew those star charts and copied these commentaries worked inside a tradition that prized reasoned argument. They debated, sometimes fiercely, where authority ended and observation began. They did not, as a rule, fantasize about ships sliding off an edge. And if you leave the libraries and step outside, the maritime knowledge of coastal communities reads as a quiet ledger of the globe. Fishermen timed their ventures to tides and currents, read the swell and the set of winds, and navigated by a sky that wrapped the world. Pilots kept rudders, practical sailing handbooks, whose very usefulness depends on a curved horizon. A spherical earth was baked into the way they moved through water. Even when medieval thinkers were wrong, they were wrong inside a rounded cosmos. They argued about the layout of the heavens' crystalline spheres or fluid shells, about the place of Earth in that arrangement, about the mathematical models that best predicted the wanderings of Mars. They did not argue about whether oceans poured over a lip into nothingness. The debate over cosmology was a drama of hierarchies and circles, not cliffs. It's also worth noticing how the symbolic and the practical touched. A ruler holding the globe suggested universal reach. A bishop blessing an orb suggested creation's order under God. Those gestures assume a common understanding between painter and viewer. Symbols can fail, but they rarely choose forms no one recognizes. A sphere communicates because both artist and audience live on one. So when we return to the dinner party, claim people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat, we can answer without heat. No, they didn't. Educated Europe kept a spherical earth in its books and in its art. Sailors lived it at sea. The persistent flat earth Middle Ages is a Victorian mirror trick, a way to make the present look taller by placing a shorter, distorted past beside it. Correcting that isn't about scoring points. It's about listening for the texture of a world that was at once practical and symbolic, learned and local. A scholar tracing eclipses in a cloister and a pilot feeling for the low swell of land share a language of curve and horizon. The past becomes clearer when we let them speak together. Tonight we'll keep doing that. We'll take other familiar pictures, the filthy bath-shy peasant, the knight staggering in armor, the castle as a gray cave, and set them beside the records of how people actually lived, not to polish the Middle Ages into a golden age, but to let the ordinary brilliance of their solutions show through. And if, along the way, we retire a few myths that live mainly because they are convenient, then we'll have done what history does best, put surprise back where certainty used to sit. The second picture people love to paint is a Europe that reeked 1,000 years of men and women who feared water, never washed, and lived under a permanent fog of a smoke and a sweat. It's vivid. It's also a caricature. Medieval hygiene was uneven, yes, and comfort looked different than ours, but an instinct for cleanliness ran through daily life, the monastery, and the market square. Start with towns. Public bathhouses were common features in medieval cities, not curiosities. In Paris, London, Cologne, Prague, you could find heated rooms with tubs or pooled basins, the estuaries of the Thames's south bank, the étuves along the Seine where people went to soak, a scrub, gossip, and strike deals. Municipal records treated them like any other business licensed, taxed, inspected for safety and morals. Some doubled as brothels, which invited periodic crackdowns. But the institution itself, a warm bath in a cold climate, persisted because it met a human need. Winter baths were scented with herbs. Summer baths left doors open to the evening air. You brought a towel, a bit of soap, and time. Soap existed, and not only for the rich. Northern makers boiled animal fat with ash lye to produce a firm, usable bar. Mediterranean workshops, drawing on older techniques, blended olive oil with soda ash to make the smoother soaps that would later give places like Marseille a reputation. Household accounts list purchases by weight. Soap was a staple of laundresses and fullers who kept linen bright and woolens wearable, and people washed more often than the stereotype allows. The full soak was occasional. Hands, face, feet, and as needed were routine. At home, the equipment was portable. A wooden tub hung on a peg until it became a Saturday night ceremony. Hot water came from kettles, extra heat from stones pulled out of the hearth and dropped with a hiss into the bath. Jugs and basins, ceramic or bronze, stood near doorways and tables for washing before meals, not just after. Aquamanals, pouring vessels cast as lions or knights, turn up in churches and manor houses. Practical tools given a craftsman's flourish. Linen, precious because of the labor required to make it, was also a quiet hygiene technology. Shirts and shifts worn next to the skin wicked sweat and could be boiled clean even when you only bathed occasionally. Monasteries made cleanliness a matter of rule. The Benedictine day included washing times, infirmaries allowed more frequent baths, and the great houses invested heavily in water management. At Cistercian sites, you can still walk along stone channels that brought fresh water to kitchens. Frater and Riridorter, the latrine range carried away by gravity. Some cloisters had lavabos at their entrances, large basins where a community rinsed hands before table. There were limits born of discipline, no endless luxuries, no scented indulgence, but the ideal was order, ritual, and regular ablution. Personal grooming was relentless because parasites were relentless. Excavations turn up horn and bone combs everywhere, from palaces to peasant cottages, fine teeth for lice, coarse teeth for snarls. Tweezers and ear scoops ride in little kits hung from belts. Tooth powders mixed salt, ash, crushed herbs, mouthwashes steeped wine with mint or sage. Perfumed gloves appear in court inventories, so the pomanders, pierced balls holding resin and spices, carried to sweeten air on the street. Fashion-joined function hair kept plaited under caps, beards trimmed to fit a trade, nails paired with knives. It wasn't a spa culture. It was a practical one. Cities tried to keep filth moving in the right direction out. Ordinances fined residents for dumping slops into lanes, required cesspits to be lined and covered, and hired night soil men to cart waste beyond the walls. Water infrastructure grew with wealth. London's great conduit sent piped water from Tyburn Springs to a public fountain. Paris multiplied fontaines and ran lead pipe into favored neighborhoods. Italian communes maintained wells as civic pride. Enforcement waxed and waned, and pigs wandering a market tell their own story. But the aspiration is clear: a cleaner street was safer and more prosperous. If medieval people bathed, where does the myth of centuries of a stink come from? Partly from later habits. In the 16th and 17th centuries, a medical fear took hold that hot water opened the pores to bad air. In plague years, some elites avoided bathhouses on theory rather than experience. Protestant and Catholic reformers alike looked hard at stews that mixed nudity and sex and shuttered many. In London, the Bankside bathhouses were finally closed by royal order in the 1540s. As public bathing declined, polemicists folded the change backward into the past and called it tradition. Then the 19th century, in love with sharp contrasts, turned the Middle Ages into a foil for modern progress and made dirt part of the costume. There's also the difference of cadence. Few people bathed daily, fuel was expensive, water heavy, and winter long. Season and status mattered. A noble household could afford heated rooms, cedar tubs, scented oils, attendants. A tenant farmer could not. But even poor families scraped together a weekly wash, took advantage of summer rivers and ponds, and stood willingly in the rain to rinse hair after a harvest day. The distance between once-a-day showers and once-a-week soaks is real. It is not the same as a millennium of refusing water. Cross-cultural exchange mattered too. In Iberia and Sicily, where Islamic and Latin Christian worlds met, hot bath culture flourished. Hammams in Andalusian towns taught generations the pleasures and health benefits of the steam and a scrub. Crusaders, who left home as suspicious novices, wrote home as enthusiasts. Techniques, scents, and habits traveled with merchants and returnees. Aleppo soaps, rose water, alum for deodorizing and dyeing. Northern Europe adapted what it could to its fuels and climate. Hygiene extended to the built world in a small ways modern visitors miss. Castle garderobes were not jokes. They were vertical shafts that vented waste outside walls, often over running water. Kitchens sat downwind when planners could manage it. In towns, butchers were pushed to riverside quarters so washings wouldn't foul drinking wells. These were imperfect solutions in imperfect systems, but they indicate a society that worried about the smells, not only because of comfort, but because bad smells were thought to signal dangerous air. Even when the theory missed the microbe, it pushed practices that sometimes helped. None of this is a bid to perfume the past. There were summers when streets baked and stank. There were winters when water froze in the bucket, and families made do with a cloth and grit. There were tenements where cesspits overflowed and discipline failed. Lice and fleas were stubborn companions, but it's a mistake to turn hardship into essence. What the records show, household accounts, civic statutes, monastic plans, the simple survival of combs and basins by the thousands is not a people indifferent to cleanliness, but a people working at it with the tools at hand. If we trade the caricature for a closer view, the sensory world of a medieval evening sharpens steam lifting from a wooden tub by the hearth, rosemary steeping in a kettle, a child with damp hair combed straight before sleep, a tavern owner hauling warm water for a paying regular, a monk washing his hands at a stone basin worn smooth by centuries of use. It is still a world of wood smoke and wet wool, of animals and people living close, but it is not a world that feared water. It reached for it regularly, resourcefully, and with more care than the myth allows. The third picture is of a pocket-sized Middle Ages, a world of undersized people ducking through toy doorways and sleeping in toy beds, 1,000 years of human hobbits. It's tidy, memorable, and wrong. If you walked a crowded market street in 14th century York or Florence, you would meet men who averaged around 170 centimeters, about 5'7", and women near 160 centimeters, about 5'3", with the usual spread above and below, sturdy, lanky, short, tall, the full bell curve of humanity jostled under wool caps and felt hats. How do we know bones tell quiet truths? Archaeologists measure long bones, especially the femur and tibia, to estimate a stature, with methods that have now been checked against modern populations. Cemetery after cemetery across Europe returns similar ranges. Urban burial grounds in England and the Low Countries, rural parishes in France, monastic plots in Germany, the numbers cluster close to modern averages for the same regions until the 17th and 18th centuries, when industrial crowding and new diseases dragged heights downward. You can even see growth disruptions, Harris lines on X-rayed bones, and enamel defects on teeth that record bouts of childhood stress, followed by catch-up growth when food or health improved. Stature is a cumulative diary of early life. It has entries in hardship ink, but it rarely ends at diminutive. So where does the visual story of a mini Europe come from? From architecture and furniture that were built for heat, habit, and health theories not for dwarfs. A low door isn't a height gauge, it's insulation. Smaller openings mean less heat lost from a one-room timber frame in January. Sleeping platforms that read short bed to modern museum eyes often served a half-reclined posture. Many Europeans believed night air carried vapors, and physicians advised stacking pillows and bolsters to keep the chest elevated. Box beds and curtained alcoves created microclimates around ticking and a straw. If you read a Manners accounts, you'll find not new tiny bed, but bolster, 2 pillows, 1 pair linen sheets, the kid of a sleeper expected to rest propped, not flat, even in castles, deep mattresses and massive bolsters shortened the visible lying length. Clothing and arms don't support the myth either. Surviving chausses, doublets, and shoes from waterlogged deposits at places like Dordrecht and London fit bodies much like ours. Armorers made plate to measure. Extant suits span a range that mirrors the variety you see on any city street. Tournament gear could be hulking, built for impact rather than agility, but field harness belonged on a moving, breathing fighter. If knights had been as small and as clumsy as the caricature demands, Europe's battlefields would have been short affairs. That said, the medieval body did answer to diet, and disease in ways that varied by place, class, and century. Protein mattered. A noble household with access to beef, mutton, river fish, game, eggs, and dairy tended to raise taller sons and daughters than a landless laborer's cottage, living mostly on bread, pottage, and ale. You can taste those differences in bone chemistry isotopic analyses, pick up the signature of animal protein and marine foods in elite skeletons. Conversely, years of dearth leave their mark. The Great Famine of 1315, Hoshua 17, stunted a cohort from Ireland to the Rhineland. So did local harvest failures we no longer remember. Then, paradoxically, the Black Death created breathing room for survivors. With fields lying fallow and labor suddenly scarce, wages rose, diets improved for many, and average stature in some regions actually ticked upward in the later 14th century. Demography nudged biology. Urban versus rural made a difference too. City children faced higher pathogen loads, bad water, close quarters, more strangers, which can sap growth even when there's enough food. Country children often had cleaner air and more daylight, but labored earlier and harder. Monastic upbringings could swing either way. Some abbeys skimped. Others fed novices solid rations and taught them to wash. In all these places, a resilient pattern shows through. People who survived the infectious gauntlet of infancy and the fevers of early childhood often reached adult heights that would not draw a second look on today's buses. Regional taste colored the spectrum. Scandinavia and the Baltic lands trend slightly taller in medieval samples. Parts of Southern Europe trend a shade shorter, which largely echoes modern distribution. Steppe peoples and migrants complicate the map. Further armies and merchants moved genes as well as goods. The medieval world was not a closed terrarium. Measurements aside, some myths hang on because they're visually convenient. A crooked beam and a low lintel photograph better than a well-proportioned truss. A tiny bed frame on a museum plinth is more arresting than a description of bolsters and posture. Effigies on tombs mislead in the other direction, puffed sleeves, elongated limbs, artistic conventions that flatten and stretch. Chroniclers muddied the waters by praising patrons as giants among men, sometimes literally. Hagiographers grew saints to fit a miracle. None of this survives basic scrutiny in aggregate, but it makes vivid copy. There is also the memory of children. The Middle Ages were full of them. High fertility met high infant and child mortality, which meant every street and farmyard teemed with small bodies and high voices. If you picture a world crowded with the young, you may unconsciously shrink everyone. Yet household lists show plenty of adults. Parish rolls note elders collecting alms. Arthritic joints and worn teeth from churchyards tell of 50 and 60-year-olds still working, still walking to Mass. Small people were everywhere because children were everywhere, not because adults were scaled down. When you scrape mud from the myth, what remains is human variety yoked to circumstance. A mason from Norfolk with bowed legs from rickets stands beside a Gascon archer with long femurs and thick humeri. A Flemish weaver's daughter, strong from treadles and hauling, stands level with a 21st century office worker. The distances between them have more to do with childhood meals and microbes than with epical destiny. Stature is not a moral tale. It's a summation of early luck and late labor. And if you step back into that market street, linen booths snapping in the wind, dogs nosing for crumbs, a piper trading tunes for coin, you can imagine jostling shoulders without stooping. A tanner broad as a door curses the price of bark. A miller taller than you want him to be pushes past with a sack. A reeve of ordinary height counts rents, unimpressed by anyone's inches. In the church near the square, a nice male hangs drying on a peg at a length that would fit your cousin. Back at the inn, the bed is shorter than you expected because the bolsters are piled high, and the host thinks sleeping flat invites a cough. None of it is a scale to fairyland. It is a scale to human needs in drafty rooms. We love extremes, the giant or the dwarf, because they promise a punchline. But the medieval body is mostly moderation, ordinary frames carrying extraordinary burdens of work, worship, fear, and joy. Not a world of children-sized adults, but a world of adults who, like us, came in sizes and stories. Dark Ages is a phrase that does a lot of heavy lifting for a very small idea. It suggests a 1,000-year blackout between Rome and the Renaissance, a Europe groping around in cultural dusk, while monks mutter and peasants poke dirt. The trouble is, when you strike a match inside the cliché, you see a different room, not dark, just differently lit. The Middle Ages were busy structuring ideas, building institutions, and experimenting with tools that would underwrite the modern world. The insult itself is late. Humanists in the 14th and 15th centuries wanted a story in which they were the dawn. To have a sunrise, you need a night. So they called what came before dark, less as a measured verdict than as a rhetorical flourish. Enlightenment writers double down because every age loves to congratulate itself. Yet if you stand in a real medieval street, the picture brightens fast. There are guild halls and courts, hospitals and almshouses, water mills chewing the river into labor, cranes on wharves, bell founders at work, and towering above, churches that look like a stone made weightless. Start with thinking, because the dull charge dies quickest there. The university is a medieval invention. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Salamanca, Padua, Cambridge, Prague. These aren't modern brands welded onto old stones. They are 13th and 14th century answers to a need: stable places where the scholars could argue safely about hard questions. Lectures, commentaries, disputations. The scholastic method was not a rote chant, but a formalized debate society. You can hear it in Thomas Aquinas's cadences, objections, replies, counter-replies, or in a classroom where a master of arts challenges students to square Aristotle with the scripture, optics with theology, law with custom. Those classrooms sat atop deeper networks. Translation centers in places like Toledo shuttled texts from Arabic and Greek into Latin. Algebra and astronomical tables rode west with translators' ink. Aristotle's physics returned to Europe via Muslim commentators. Numerals that are now simply numbers reached schoolrooms that once counted with Roman letters. The monastery, caricatured as a refuge from thought, was often an engine of it. Scriptoria kept copying rooms warm. Libraries kept catalogs. Some houses ran observatories to fix the date of Easter, which forced better astronomy. A monk might brew in the morning, tend an herb garden at noon, and collate manuscripts before Compline. The material world kept pace. Mechanical clocks appeared in the late 1200s and 1300s, escapements, ticking time into measurable units on towers that still command city squares. Spectacles show up around the same moment, letting craftsmen and scholars push their working lives beyond what their eyes alone allowed. Windmills spread, watermills multiplied, the horse collar, heavy plow, and three-field rotation boosted grain yields. In shipyards, stern-post rudders, better rigs, and stronger hulls lengthened voyages and shrank the subjective map. Bills of exchange and double-entry bookkeeping stabilized long-distance trade, linking the fairs of Champagne to the counting houses of Italian cities and the quays of the North Sea. If this is dark, it is the darkness of ink drying under a busy clerk's sand. Architecture demolished gloom with glass. Gothic builders learned to push weight out and down through pointed arches and flying buttresses, freeing walls for windows the size of dreams. Walk into Chartres on a bright day and you understand why a 12th century abbot called it Lux Nova. New light blue and ruby poured through stories in stained glass, whole Bibles lit into the stone. Dim candlelight is a modern museum mood. Medieval daylight, when you could get it, was a theology of illumination. The arts were not an afterthought. Polyphony blossomed in Paris under composers we now label Léonin and Perrotin. Courtly lyric traveled with troubadours across Occitania and up into northern courts. Mystery and miracle plays moved scripture into the street with scenery, jokes, and smoke. Painters gilded panel altar pieces. Carvers laced choir stalls with saints and sinners and sly, laughing grotesques. A scribe illuminating a book of hours in Bruges or Paris wasn't killing time until the Renaissance arrived. He was meeting a market of lay people who wanted prayer in their hands, in their own tongue, and on their own timetable. Nor were lives monotonous between plow and pew. The calendar was punctuated by feast days and fairs, by marriages and wakes and civic processions. Carnival inverted hierarchies before Lent reset them. Archery practice and quarterstaff bouts drew crowds. Tournaments, with all their risks and theater, turned war's skills into sport and a spectacle. Traveling entertainers tumbled, sang, and needled the powerful with wit sharp enough to survive in manuscript. Market days were chaos with a purpose, chickens underfoot, apprentices shouting weights, a surgeon demonstrating a new tree-panning tool to a ring of fascinated, slightly pale onlookers. Even law moved, trial by ordeal, the hot iron, the boiling pot. The river's judgment lost official support after 1215, replaced by inquiries and proofs more legible to reason. Charters regularized rights and obligations. Communes negotiated with lords. Customary law got written down and glossed. The later Middle Ages could be violent, but they were not lawless by default. And when authority did overreach, there were forms for pushing back, from village assemblies to, in one famous meadow, a charter sealed against a king. What about the darkness as literal dimness? The idea that rooms were perpetually gloomy and minds followed. Interiors were often warmer and brighter than modern reenactments make them whitewashed walls, reflecting light. Rush mats replaced seasonally. Shutters and glazed windows where people could afford them. Candles of tallow for ordinary use and beeswax for churches and the wealthy. People knew how to aim light, how to place a writing desk near a small south-facing window. how to polish a brass lamp to spread a flame's reach. They read at dawn, at dusk, at noon. They recited by memory when light failed. They were not waiting for LEDs to become human. None of this denies hardship. Famines, plagues, and wars could wreck a region's fortunes for a generation. There were reactionary edicts and intellectual cul-de-sacs, but every age has weather and traffic. The myth of uninterrupted darkness flattens a landscape that is all hills and valleys, centuries of experimentation, punctuated by disaster and recovery. If you plotted a graph for change, the Middle Ages would not be a flat line. It would be a sawtooth, trending upward through noise. We inherit, too, the medieval habit of joining unlike things. Faith and reason share a desk in a university lecture. A bell that marks prayer also marks working hours. A merchant finances a voyage with instruments a canon lawyer helped define. The borders we draw between religion and science, art and craft, are modern filing systems. Medieval people filed by purpose. Does it save, heal, feed, build, bind? If so, it belongs. So the next time someone lowers their voice to say Dark Ages, imagine instead a street at mid-morning. A scribe passes carrying quires. A carpenter argues about beam lengths. Students in gowns spill from a rented hall still debating a master's question. A bell rings the quarter. In the distance, masons sing on scaffolding as they lift a rib into place that will, months from now, hold a window of prophets and kings. The light in that world was not merely physical. It came from habits of copying, testing, disputing, building that refused to go out. Medieval food was bland is one of those lines that survives because it flatters our tongues. We imagine a Europe of gray stews and grayer bread, people chewing pennants 3 times a day until the Renaissance finally invents taste. But if you open a medieval cookbook, or better, step into a kitchen on a feast day, the air stings with cinnamon and ginger, brightens with saffron, and softens with almond milk simmering at the edge of the hearth. The table was not a desert, it was a map. Begin with the obvious spices. They were not pinches of novelty doled out at Christmas. They moved in caravans and cogs, counted in pounds and barrels, and they flavored daily cooking where money allowed. Pepper was everywhere, so common in city accounts that rents and fines were sometimes tallied in it. Alongside came cinnamon, cloves, long pepper, grains of paradise, nutmeg, mace, ginger. These weren't dusted with restraint. Recipes often call for a spoonfuls, folded into sauces, wine, even pottages. Saffron, dear as gold leaf, colored rice and fish into sunlight. Mustard, pounded with vinegar. Verjuice, or wine bit through fat and put fire on meat. A standard pantry could hold poudre forte and poudre douce. Premixed spice blends away a modern cook keeps paprika and curry powder within reach. Sugar, far from a rare jewel, appears constantly in elite kitchens and increasingly among prosperous townsfolk. It came shaped into loaves to be scraped and dissolved. It sweetened almond milk sauces and tipped wines into hippocras, spiced and strained for the end of meals. And almonds themselves ground with water or broth into a white. Velvety milk were not a vegan novelty. They were technology. Almond milk let cooks thicken sauces without dairy on fast days, carry flavor without a spoilage, and deliver richness even in winter. Fish days often 3 per week under church rules. more during Lent drove creativity. Eels, herring, stockfish, salmon, lamprey for the wealthy poached, baked in pies, sauced in green herbs. When butter was forbidden, oil and almond milk stepped in. When meat was banned, spice and vinegar taught the palate other pleasures. Cookbooks from the period read like passports. The form of curry in England sends you to cameline sauce bread, wine, cinnamon, ginger, and vinegar reduced to a sweet-sour gloss for roasted meats. Le Viandier, attributed to Taillevent in France, loves bright acidity and color. It asks for parsley green sauces, yellow with saffron, red with sandalwood. In Italy, Maestro Martino thickens dishes with egg yolks and cooks fish with citrus. In Iberia, texts from Al-Andalus fold rice, sugar, almonds, and spices into dishes that feel startlingly modern. The trade routes that delivered pepper also delivered ideas, and the medieval kitchen took them up happily. And then the spectacle. Feasts were theater with knives for stage hands. A peacock could be roasted and dressed again in its own jewel-toned feathers, a shimmering trophy carried to the high table. Entremet between courses were edible illusions, castles made of pastry, pies that opened to release living birds, boars' heads masked in gilding. The effect was not only a pleasure, it was power. To color food was to assert mastery over matter. To turn a pike green and a sauce gold told guests they were seated in a household where distances, geographic and symbolic, collapsed into the kitchen. If that sounds like courtly excess, it was. But the myth of universal blandness depends on a trick of averages. Most people did not dine beneath painted rafters on subtleties and swan. Most today do not either. The question is what everyday food tasted like. And here the story also refuses gray. Bread varied fine white manchettes for the wealthy, muslin loaves of mixed rye and wheat for many, rougher horse bread in hard times. Pottages, the ubiquitous stews, were platforms, not punishments. Leeks and onions, cabbage and peas, barley and oats thickened the pot. A scrap of bacon, a bone, or a handful of salted fish shifted flavor toward smoke or sea. Herbs, parsley, sage, dill, fennel, savory, hyssop, borage grew in dooryard plots and were used not as garnish but as substance. Vinegar or verjuice, the tart juice of unripe grapes, added lift where lemons were rare. Nothing in that bowl is bland unless the season is cruel. Seasonality, in fact, is the quiet key. Spring pushed up tender greens. Summer filled markets with cherries, plums, and early pears. Autumn brought apples, nuts, and slaughtered livestock rich with fat. Winter leaned on stores of salted meat, dried fish, smoked sausages, cheeses, pickled vegetables. Preservation was a skill and a flavor. Smoke and salt were recipes, not compromises. And pickling created brightness when daylight failed. Communal bakehouses in towns supplied crusts crisp enough to carry stews. Households brewed small ale, mild and nourishing because water safety varied, and brewing was both sanitation and sustenance. In wine regions, vintners and household kept casks that would sour into excellent vinegars when the vintage disappointed. All of this is taste, layered and learned. Color mattered even below the dice. Saffron is dear, but marigold petals or ground parsley could brighten broths. Tournesol, a plant dye, shifted syrups purple. Alkanet deepened reds. A dish's hue signaled humoral thinking, the medical framework that tied food to the body's inner weather. Sweet and sour combinations were not quirks. They aimed at balance heat tempered by acidity, dryness moistened by sugar or almond. That's why meat with raisins and prunes, fish with ginger and vinegar, or pies with dates and pine nuts appear so often. The palate behind them is finely tuned to contrast and relief, not numb repetition. Even the lowly tavern, the place critics imagine as stew cauldrons and a spilled ale, competed for custom. City ordinances regulated the quality of wine and bread. Guilds oversaw butchers, fishmongers, pie sellers. A traveler could expect a hot dish in a cookshop, baked herring with mustard and onions, bruet of beef spiked with pepper, a thick, peppery sausage, and a trencher to soak the juices. Street food had a medieval life: hot pies in London, waffles and wafers near churches on feast days, roasted chestnuts in winter. A midday market smells different from a court feast. It does not smell like nothing. What about the stubborn canard that spices masked rotting meat? It flatters our modern hygiene to imagine ancestors saving dinner with cloves. In reality, imported spices were too expensive to waste on garbage, and the risk of illness too immediate to court deliberately. Salt, smoke, air, and cold were preservation, spices were the status, and taste. When meat was past its prime, it was soup or sausage, where long cooking and fermentation made safety, not cosmetics. Recipes that pair a spice with meat do so with fresh or properly cured cuts. The aim is harmony under a theory of health, not perfume over decay. Kitchen technology pulled weight. Hearths with cranes swung iron pots over coals for precise simmering. Spits turned before flames for roasts basted with herb brushes. Bake ovens fired once or twice a week, banked heat into bread, then pies, then custards as the temperature fell. A good cook rid an oven like a clock. At big houses, separate pastry kitchens produced coffins, sturdy pastry shells that were containers and sometimes plates. Standing pies could travel from kitchen to hall without a modern pan in sight. None of this is bland, it is infrastructure. And when times were hard, when blight or war thinned the pantry, people remembered intensity. That is why feast days mattered. A parish baked an ox and shared it. A guild staged a banquet not only to display wealth, but to underline community spices passed hand to hand. A literal circulation of value and pleasure. A winter evening with a bowl of hot, peppered pottage after a day in the cold is not culinary emptiness. It is relief engineered by practice. So keep the joke if you like. It is a durable laugh line. But a medieval cook would taste our era's suspicion and raise us a table river fish glossed with green sauce, a capon scented with ginger, sugar, and verjuice, a trencher of bread soaking a cinnamon dark camelane, pears poached in wine, served with a spoon of snow white almond cream. The flavors are not our usual, but they are not timid. They speak a language our tongues still understand: acid to wake, fat to soothe, spice to quicken, sweet to close. Blandness is what happens when you stop listening. In the medieval kitchen, the conversation never stopped. Picture the clank of plate in a stone corridor. A figure in a steel steps forward. The visor drops. And if you learned your Middle Ages from cartoons, someone nudges him over and he thrashes like a stranded beetle. It's funny until you remember that Europe trusted those men to keep cities from burning. An army of overturned turtles is not how you hold a bridge. A well-made harness of plate weighed roughly as much as a modern backpacking load. And more importantly, it wore that weight better. 20 to 25 kilograms spread over the entire body make for a different experience than the same mass sagging from your shoulders. Armorers carved anatomy into steel breastplates that curved to deflect, falls and tassets that lapped like shutters, couters and paulins with sliding lames that bent and straightened with the elbow and knee, fingers flexed in gauntlets of overlapping scales. The result was not a metal statue, but a second skin. Knights trained to move in it because their lives demanded it running, vaulting into the saddle, wrestling, grappling with pole axes, climbing siege ladders while arrows stitched the air. If you want the medieval receipts, they survive in ink. Fight books from the 14th and 15th centuries show armored men grappling, throwing, and rolling with a grace that assumes mobility. Masters like Fiore de Liberi and Hans Talhofer instruct students to close distance in plate, hook legs, trip, pin, then finish with a rondel dagger at the visor gap tactics that would be impossible for a human tin can. The techniques presume a footwork, bursts of speed, and a flexible waist. They also assume you can see and breathe, which is why visors are lifted between charges and lowered when arrows fly. Armor was not a prison, it was a tool with settings. A field harness had to balance three demands: protection, movement, and endurance. Your breastplate might be proofed against a quarrel or a bullet. At very close range, some pieces still carry dark, coin-sized test dents, but proof costs weight. So a soldier's kit rested on layers of padded jack or gambeson closest to the skin. Mail, where it mattered, armpits, groin, neck, and plate over the vitals. You could run in that. You could also fight for hours. Contemporary accounts describe men-at-arms marching in armor, then charging on foot when horses foundered in mud. They don't mention anyone asking for a crane. That crane, let's talk about it, because the image is sticky. The hoist belongs to a different creature tournament armor. In late medieval and early modern Europe, jousts evolved into highly specialized sports with rule sets and safety innovations that hardened into gear immense breastplates, Grand Guard plates bolted on for the tilt, frog-mouth helmets with slitted vision designed for a single pass on a straight track. Some tilt armors were so heavy and so stiff that mounting required assistance. They were superb at one thing and terrible at everything else. Confusing that for battlefield kit is like thinking an NFL lineman plays Sunday in a mascot suit. Another culprit for the wobbling knight myth is the 19th century. The romance of the Middle Ages surged, so did collecting. Victorian display suits were often made from mismatched parts, or thick new steel meant to shine on a plinth, not flex in a melee. Put an unfit gentleman into a rigid, ill-sized costume and he will move exactly as badly as you'd expect. Then he will tell dinner guests that medieval people were ridiculous. Meanwhile, the real harnesses, Milanese and Gothic lines built to measure, with narrow waists, fluted thighs, graceful gorgets made to turn the head, rested a few galleries away, empty and eloquent. Modern testing puts muscle on the page. When trained reenactors and athletes run, climb, and fence in accurate reproductions, heart rates rise, but so do feats. Sprinting, Jumping, kneeling, and standing repeatedly. Even performing somersaults are possible in a good harness. The drag is real, the impossibility is not. Watch a man in plate bound onto a horse from a 3-step block, or swing into the saddle from ground with a hand on the pommel and a hop. It takes practice. So does everything that matters. If plate did not immobilize, what did it do? It changed the game. Against missile weapons, armor forced archers to adjust targets. Shafts that once sawed rib and lung now aimed for gaps the inside of the elbow, the groin, the visor slit and hoped for chance. Against cutting weapons, plate turned blades into bells. That's why armored combat manuals emphasize half-swording, gripping the blade with the offhand to thrust like a short spear. Mordau, striking with the hilt like a hammer, and hooking with pole axes. The goal becomes to unbalance, to throw, to pry open, not to slice. Mobility is essential because openings are brief and arrive with motion during a lunge, in a clinch, as one fighter stumbles back. If you can't move, you can't create those moments. What about heat? It mattered. Fighting under sun in steel and padding is work, but the harness itself ventilates better than a full mail shirt. Plates trap less air than a dense weave of rings, and the gaps at armpits and along the spine breathe when you do. Commanders planned engagements for endurance charges timed, reserves held, horses rotated. Knights learned to manage exertion, like modern soldiers pacing a march. And yes, exhaustion and heat stroke existed. So did soldiers fainting today in modern gear. The problem is not the century, it is the load and the weather. A note on sound and sight, because armor's music deceives. Hollywood loves the heavy clatter, the clang with every step. Real harness is quieter. Leather points, arming cords, and well-fit lames keep the orchestra muted. Visors narrow vision, but so do helmets in any age. Soldiers raise them when they can. The famous frog mouth is virtually blind from above. It was designed to face a single lance tip from one direction, so it looks like proof of blindness. It is, in a sport someone chose. On campaign, knights wore sallets, armets, or bassinets with movable visors, good compromise pieces that let you see to march, breathe to climb, and still close down when it hailed arrows. If armor allowed movement, why do some chronicles mention fallen men who could not rise? Often because the battlefield has its own gravity. Mud bodies, broken weapons, and the weight of another man pinning you make standing hard in any kit. A lance charge that shatters into melee leaves horses and men tangled. A rider thrown with a destrier rolling over him might lie dazed, not because of a steel, but because of the horse. And in the press of hand to hand, enemies do not politely let you regain your feet. They plant a boot, and the dagger arrives. Training is the part we forget. Young nobles learned from childhood striking at the pell, a wooden post to harden the arm, tilting at the quintain to time a blow from the saddle, climbing, vaulting, swimming, playing games that were drills disguised as a sport. The gym was a tilt yard, a courtyard, a hall with a beam. By the time a man strapped on a harness of his own, his body knew how to wear it. Competence looks like magic to those who never had to earn it. There's a deeper reason the turtle myth survives. It flatters the modern. If they were clumsy, we are clever. If they were trapped in their tools, we are free in ours. but a harness of plate is a problem solved with craft and sweat. It answers arrows and axes by turning the wearer into something more than flesh. It promises time, seconds more to stand, to strike, to survive at the cost of training and coin. On a winter road, watch a man in plate swing over a ditch, jog a short hill, then take off his gauntlet to drink and laugh with his companions. The sound is leather, breath, and a faint chime from the lames, not a turtle, not a statue, a soldier moving. If you took your cues from pop culture, you'd think the medieval church kept a bonfire crackling at all times, ready for the next heretical gadget or dangerous idea. In the imagination, a hooded committee prowls libraries, confiscating lenses, smashing astrolabes, and hissing at anyone who so much as whispers experiment. It makes for neat drama. It just makes poor history. The people who copied, taught, and often advanced natural knowledge in the Middle Ages were frequently the same people who rang the church bells. Start with the buildings. Europe's first universities, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Montpellier grew out of cathedral and monastic schools. Their legal charters were blessed by popes. Their faculty often wore clerical robes. Inside those chilly halls, natural philosophy sat beside theology on the curriculum. Students argued about optics, motion, the structure of the heavens, the behavior of light in glass and water. What we call a science had different names and a different scaffolding, but it happened at lecture pulpits and disputation benches under a stained glass. Turn the pages the monks preserved in scriptoria that smelled of ink and lamp smoke. Scribes copied Aristotle's works on physics and animals, Euclid's geometry, Ptolemy's astronomy texts funneled into Latin through a translation pipeline that ran from Arabic-speaking scholars in places like Toledo and Palermo back to the schools of Northern Europe. Alongside those came commentaries by Muslim and Jewish philosophers and physicians, Avicenna, Averroes, Maimonides, whose ideas were studied line by line. The church did not seal Europe off from this traffic. Much of that traffic flowed into church-run classrooms. Because the calendar mattered, so did the heavens. To celebrate Easter together, Christendom needed the computus, the mathematical art of fixing the date based on lunar cycles and the spring equinox. The Venerable Bede wrote handbooks, monks kept tables, cathedral clergy tracked solstices from cloister gardens and tower windows. When you see a medieval cleric peering at the sky, he is not plotting to ban astronomy. He is doing astronomy so the feasts will be in harmony. Walk the libraries and you find names that should change the picture. Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, wrote on light as a first principle and treated inquiry as a cycle: observe, hypothesize, test, revise. His student Roger Bacon pleaded for mathematics and experiment, analyzed lenses, and imagined what better glass might do. In Paris, John Buridan and Nicole Oresme worried at motion and impetus ideas that nudged Europe away from Aristotle's mover must keep pushing toward something closer to inertia. At Cologne, Albertus Magnus cataloged plants and rocks with the patience of a field naturalist. Hildegard of Bingen wrote of herbs and healing. At Merton College in Oxford, a circle sometimes called the calculators played with velocity and change, putting numbers to motion centuries before the word physics meant what it does now. These were not dissidents sneaking work in the attic. They taught in charterist schools, debated under the painted eyes of saints, and took their salaries from institutions that also funded choirs. The same orders that copied psalters brewed beer and kept infirmaries that evolved into hospitals. Monastic houses maintained physic gardens. Cathedral towns hosted instrument makers who built astrolabes and quadrants for clerical scholars who needed to measure sky. If the medieval church had truly despised inquiry, it chose a strange way to show it by housing it. Boundaries existed, so did friction. A university was not a lawless playground. In 1277, Bishop Etienne Tempier of Paris issued condemnations of certain propositions, some genuinely theological, some philosophical extrapolations that worried the guardians of doctrine. The intent was to remind the scholars that not every Aristotelian conclusion could be baptized. Ironically, those very constraints forced thinkers to imagine alternatives if the heavens were not eternally necessary. Could God have made a different cosmos if motion didn't require constant movers? What then ideas bent to pass the gate and came out a stranger and sometimes richer on the other side? The famous clash over the structure of the cosmos comes later. Medieval classrooms largely taught a geocentric universe because that was the most developed astronomical model available in Latin, wrapped in circles and epicycles by Ptolemy, refined by Islamic astronomers, and useful for calendars and astrology alike. The Church did not convene tribunals against heliocentrism because heliocentrism was not yet a workable system in those classrooms. It was a twinkle in a few ancient pages. When early modern astronomers finally marshaled better observations and new mathematics, arguments with authority sharpened. But those 17th century storms do not describe the weather of the 13th. The work was practical as well as speculative. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe sees a burst of mechanical ingenuity, water, and windmills multiply. Weight-driven clocks appear on cathedral towers, their striking hammers announcing the hours for prayer and market alike. Spectacles emerge from Italian workshops and change what aging scholars can read. None of these belong to a clandestine technologists' guild, hunted by friars. They belong to a society in which clerics bought lenses, listened for the bell, and blessed mills on the river. Medicine offers the same mixed picture of constraint and care. The medical faculty at Montpellier trained physicians on Galen and Hippocrates alongside newer Arabic and Jewish texts, while religious orders ran hospitals where regimen, clean bedding, broth, herbal remedies, prayer was the standard of compassion. Humoral theory guided treatments we now find misguided, but the institutions that organized care and the manuscripts that transmitted remedies had crosses on the doors and in the margins. There were prohibitions, some books were suspect, some ideas declared unsafe, some practitioners disciplined for mingling natural causes with cosmologies that denied creation. But the broad claim that the medieval church banned or smothered science cannot survive contact with the daily texture of the period. It was friars building observatories into cloister walks, bishops endowing chairs, abbots paying instrument makers, deans scolding the students for brawling in the street after a disputation on optics. It was messy and human and, crucially, institutional, a framework strong enough to keep arguments going for centuries. Even the style of thinking has errors in the lab. Scholastic disputation pose a question. State objections, argue a response. Address the objections reads like a seminar turned formal. Replace the Latin with technical English and the flow is not so alien. Define terms, state the problem, test a hypothesis, answer critics. The medievals did not practice science with our vocabulary, but they practiced disciplined inquiry with methods that would not be entirely out of place in a graduate colloquium. Why, then, does the myth hold? Because it flatters us. It lets moderns imagine that light sprang from a void, that cleverness arrived ex nihilo after centuries of darkness imposed by cassocks and candles. The truth is slower and more interesting. Ideas crossed languages and religions, found patrons under vaulted ceilings, learned to live within rules, and sometimes strained against them. A monk tilting an astrolabe in a winter garden to catch the sun at noon is not an enemy of knowledge. He is one of its stewards. When you step back, the outline sharpens an age that built schools before laboratories, that calculated feasts to understand the moon, that read Aristotle to argue with him, that kept fragile books alive so later generations could disagree more precisely. There were bonfires, there were bans, there were brave arguments and anxious corrections, but there were also syllabi, repairs to instruments, budgets balanced by deans, and young scholars spending long nights over borrowed pages. If you want to watch medieval Europe nurture science, don't look for torches at the door. Look for the candle by a glossed text, the metal worker filing teeth on a clock wheel for the cathedral's south transept, the master in a cold hall telling students to bring their objections tomorrow in order, with reasons. The future is in those reasons. 30. The number gets tossed around like a punchline, proof that medieval people lived fast, died young, and spent their brief intermission stacking wood for their own funerals. It's tidy, shocking, and almost completely misleading. That infamous figure is an average, a blunt instrument that mixes together everyone, the baby who never sees a spring, the mother who dies in childbirth, the plowman who lives to grumble about his joints at 65, into one depressing statistic. If you want to know how long a medieval person could expect to live, you have to separate beginnings from survivals. Demographers use two different yardsticks: life expectancy at birth and conditional life expectancy. What your prospects look like if you've already cleared the most dangerous hurdles. In the Middle Ages, birth and early childhood were the cliffs. Disease, diarrhea from foul water, infections without antibiotics, congenital problems no one could fix. These took a brutal toll. In many communities, a third of children died before their 5th birthday. Add the mothers lost in childbirth and the occasional famine or epidemic, and the average plummets. Fold all of that into one number, and yes, 30 can emerge from the math. But a step through that doorway survived the first 5 years and the picture changes sharply. A child who reached age 5 could often expect decades more. Not a guarantee of old age, but a fair chance at 50, sometimes 60 or beyond if luck, diet, and peace held. You can see the reality in places where names and ages survive necrologies in monasteries that record brothers dying at 60 and 70. City almshouses established precisely because there were elderly poor to shelter. Guild statutes promising support to aged members. Testaments by grandmothers parceling out linens and beads to daughters' daughters. Bones tell the same story as skeletons with fused vertebrae. Worn teeth. Arthritis blooming in hips and knees, signatures of bodies that have moved through long, demanding lives. The arithmetic trap is easy to illustrate. Imagine a small village with 10 births in a bad year. 3 infants die, thus one child dies at 2, another at 4. The remaining 6 children grow up to 55, 58, 60, 62, 64, and 70. Average those 10 lives and you get a bleak number. But it doesn't describe any individual's trajectory. It is an index of danger at the start, not a prophecy that a 30-year-old drops dead on his name day like a character on a grim stage. Think about work and custom. Medieval law codes and manorial accounts assume elders exist. Men too old for field labor get lighter dues. Widows hold cottages and pay reduced rents. Parish charity lists make provision for impotent poor who are not infants but worn-out adults. Chronicles grumble about ancient knights who still preside at feasts. Bishops write pastoral letters about caring for infirm parents. Saints' lives mention women who lived to a great age before retiring to the cloister. None of this would make sense in a world where everyone toppled over at the onset of gray hair. Of course, a hazard stalked every age. Accidents were common in a landscape of open hearths, heavy carts, and unguarded water. A bad cut could turn to sepsis. A winter chill could sink into the lungs and stay. Warfare pulled the unlucky into danger not of their choosing, and when true catastrophe arrived, plague, siege, harvest failure, it scythed through the careful arithmetic of ordinary years. Even then, survival did not vanish. After the Black Death's first pass, communities stabilized. Those who lived sometimes benefited from better diets and higher wages, which for a time nudged adult survivorship upward. The point isn't to romanticize, it is to recognize that hard and short are not synonyms. Marriage patterns offer another window. In much of Northern Europe, men married in their mid to late 20s, women a bit younger. That gap presumes adulthood lasting well beyond 30. Otherwise, grandparents would be unicorns. Yet grandparents appear explicitly in letters, implicitly in dowries that include the mother's belongings, visibly in the shorthand of family memory. The language of the period has words for the stages of life beyond youth that aren't just theoretical senex old, vetula old woman, goodman and good wife applied to elders with a tone of respect, edged with familiarity. Plays and sermons, forever moralizing, take for granted the stubbornness and wisdom of the old. Work changed with age rather than stopping. A craftsman whose eyes no longer allowed him to paint fine borders shifted to larger tasks or to teaching apprentices. A peasant who couldn't handle the plow drove oxen, mended hedges, watched sheep. Women who had raised their children took in boarders, spun, brewed, and became the memory of a household advisors as much as laborers. None of it is glamorous. All of it assumes years beyond the meridian. If you want a number cautiously held, historians often suggest that in a reasonably good pre-modern setting, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30-35. At age 5, it vaulted into the 40s or 50s. At age 20, it rose again, making a death in the 60s perfectly ordinary. Not everyone reached that threshold. Some lived longer. Tomb inscriptions announcing 80 years are not unknown. Monks boasted, with a certain dry humor, of brothers who outlived 3 abbots and the discipline of 2. On the other side, the middle-aged could be felled by a single bad winter. Life was a lottery with weighted dice. The persistence of the 30 myth serves an emotional purpose. It lets us flatten the past into a grotesque, reassuringly distant caricature. We are modern, they were doomed. But it also erases continuity. The anxiety about nursing a feverish child, the relief when a cough breaks, the way communities rally around a frail neighbor, those threads run through medieval documents as surely as they do through our timelines. Town councils organized watches to help the sick. Parish fraternities brought broth. Neighbors sat up through the night. If people never lived long enough to need such care, whole sections of the record would be inexplicable. It helps, too, to remember what time felt like. Without our electric glare and alarm clocks, days were paced by bells, sunlight, and task. Winters stretched, summers sprinted. A 60-year-old in that world had stacked and unstacked harvests 40 times, faced hunger and relief in cycles, buried friends, watched children become householders, seen fashion in shoes and prayers shift. Age carried weight because it meant accumulated bargains with the world, wisdom earned by bruises. None of this negates the real bitter edge of medieval mortality. Mothers did die in childbed. Children were mourned in the plural. Epidemics could upend a generation's hope in a season, but standing inside those truths is different from standing outside and saying, 30? From inside, the bed looks like this: do everything you can to get the children through the narrow gate. Manage risks that can be managed, accept the ones that can't. Make room at the fire for the voices that remember how to bind a scythe and when to plant beans by the moon. So keep the statistic if you must just label it correctly. Life expectancy at birth is a measure of hazard at the start, not a verdict on the span of a life. If you had walked a medieval street at dusk, you would have seen boys running, girls skipping ropes plaited from a straw, men home from fields or shops, and old women with shawls folded tight against the cold, trading news in doorways. Some of those women were as sharp as hawks at 70. You would have heard them laugh. If you go by movie nights and paperback covers, the medieval calendar included a regular appointment right after the market bell and before alehouse closing time, which burning, torches, pointy hats. A town, a square, like a stage set for moral panic. The Middle Ages, we're told, were one long bonfire, but strike a match against the records and the flame sputters. The great witch persecutions that haunt our imagination belong mostly to a later age, the 15th to 17th centuries, after Gutenberg's press had spread manuals of detection, after legal systems had shifted, and after religious conflict sharpened suspicion into policy. Medieval Europe had plenty of sins to answer for, but a continent-wide barbecue of witches was not one of them. Start where churchmen themselves began. In the early medieval centuries, learned authorities tended to treat tales of night flights and Sabbaths as delusions. A widely copied text, known to later readers as the Canon Episcopi, dismissed women who claimed to ride with pagan goddesses as deceived by the devil in dreams, rather than physically soaring over hedgerows. The remedy, said the text, was preaching and penance, not prayers. That posture mattered because bishops set the tone for courts in their orbit. If a clerk thought the story was trickery of the mind, he was less likely to recommend fuel. This skepticism didn't mean that magic was approved. Charms, malefice, harmful sorcery, the vocabulary is large, fell under a broad ban on superstition. But enforcement usually looked like fines, penances, or local shaming. When the church built a specialized machinery to fight danger, the cogs were aimed at heresy. The medieval Inquisitions sharpened their tools on Cathars, Waldensians, and later on, political dissenters. Witchcraft, as a diabolical conspiracy, was not yet the center of gravity. In manorial and town courts, accusations of harmful magic appear, but punishments often stopped short of death. Hangings occurred in some regions. Banishment and the estocs were common. Arson and execution were rarer and localized. Firewood, after all, was precious. So was social peace. So what changed? Not one thing, but several. In the later 15th century, learned demonology hardened. A cluster of university-trained authors began to argue that malefice was not merely a neighbor's nasty trick, but proof of a pact with the devil, an organized, conspiratorial assault on Christendom. Printing houses gave those arguments legs. A single handbook could now stride across borders, recruiting magistrates to a new intensity. The most notorious of these manuals, a compendium of lurid claims and bad method, flourished precisely because paper multiplied its reach. Meanwhile, law itself had evolved. Under older accusatorial procedures, a private accuser carried the risk of losing if charges failed. Under inquisitorial models, officials could pursue suspicion ex officio, with the power to investigate, interrogate, and fatally use torture to reconcile testimony with theory. The door between fear and proof swung open. Add weather and war to the mix. The so-called Little Ice Age shrank growing seasons. Harvests soured, cattle sickened in pens, disease grabbed children by the handful. In bad years, all of that misery demanded a face. The easiest face to draw was the estranged one, an old widow, an herbalist with sharp elbows, a newcomer who prayed in the wrong cadence. Early modern Europe, racked by confessional rifts after the Reformation, found in witchcraft a crime both sides could prosecute to prove their zeal. The terror was not medieval, it was modern in the most unsettling sense. It used print, bureaucracy, and the state muscle to make fear efficient. Numbers tell a quieter truth than legends. The best estimates for executions in the broader European witch hunts range from roughly 40 to 60,000, spread over 3 centuries and concentrated in distinct hotspots: German lands, the Swiss cantons, parts of eastern France and Scotland, rather than evenly across the map. Medieval centuries contribute comparatively few confirmed burnings. The paperwork that survives from the 13th and 14th centuries shows far more energy spent on policing usury, blasphemy, and heresy than on roasting sorceresses en masse. Where the stake did appear, it was often for relapsed heretics or political rebels whose charges mingled treason and theology. The witch-burning engine had not yet been built. Even when you peer into medieval village quarrels, the texture is different from the postcard of a mob with torches. A cow goes dry, a baby fails to thrive. Someone mutters that Marjorie's eye is ill-fortuned. The reeve and juror's neighbors, not strangers, call Marjorie before the court. She swears an oath, perhaps touches a relic, pays a fine, promises to avoid suspicious gatherings, and returns to a life bounded by hedges and habit. Harmful magic remained a category of wrongdoing, but it sat cheek by jowl with slander, boundary disputes, and broken ale measures. Daily justice aimed to stitch small rips, not stage a public immolation. There were, of course, borderlands and exceptions, alpine towns with overlapping jurisdictions and fractious politics, incubated some of the earliest intense prosecutions. Frontier zones where pastoral and agricultural economies collided bred their own anxieties about weather, wolves, and wandering healers. Even in the Middle Ages, rumor could flash to fire when famine sharpened tempers. But the great, relentless machinery, the serial trials, the chain denunciations, the printed demonologies stacked like cordwood that belong to a later climate. It's useful to ask why the bonfire myth sticks to the Middle Ages rather than to the centuries that actually burned most. Partly it's the same habit that flattens so many medieval topics we like our Dark Ages properly dark. Partly its narrative economy lump all cruelty together, said it long ago, and congratulate ourselves on having evolved. And partly it's an optical effect. Medieval art gives us devils with bat wings and grinning hellmouths. Early modern woodcuts give us courtrooms and scaffolds. We borrow the devils for color and the scaffolds for plot, then mash them into one spurious scene. Pull the two eras apart and the people within them come into focus. Medieval churchmen arguing, sometimes wearily, that supposed night flights are dreams. Village jurors leaning on reputation and custom to diffuse quarrels. Healers carrying a bag of herbs and prayers, tolerated until they failed. Later, magistrates with printed handbooks, professional witch-finders traveling circuit, pamphlets hawked in the marketplaces promising to unmask the devil's midwives. These are not the same world. There is a sobering epilogue in that contrast. The Middle Ages, for all their harshness, often kept panic local. Early modern Europe, smarter and better organized, could scale panic up. Bureaucracy gave fear an itinerary. Literacy gave it a script. The failures in both periods warn in different ways. Small communities can be petty and cruel. Large systems can be cold and devastating. To understand that is not to exonerate the past. It is to recognize how easily any age can mistake anxiety for evidence and ritual for remedy. So put away the weekly bonfire in the town square. If you had wandered through a real medieval marketplace on a feast day, you'd have heard minstrels and hawkers gossip about a parish boundary, and perhaps a muttered warning about a charm maker who charges too much for rosemary. Someone might have told a story about a night ride, then laughed and crossed themselves. The torchlight you saw at dusk wasn't for a stake. It was for getting home in the dark. If popular culture is to be believed, medieval peasants were voiceless figures pressed into the mud human scenery for the dramas of kings and knights. The truth is quieter and more complicated. Most peasants did live hard lives, but they also lived within legal frameworks they understood, argued in courts that recorded their names, and guarded a bundle of customs that gave them leverage against both neighbors and lords. Their world was not lawless. It was dense with law, local, customary, and often fiercely defended. Begin with the manorial court, the weekly or fortnightly gathering where the business of a village walked in on 2 feet and took a seat. Surviving court rolls long lists written by clerks who dwelt among the people they served record far more than rents do. They show jurors elected from the tenants presenting nuisances and quarrels, reeves and constables managing harvest obligations, women immersed for selling ale against the assize, and men for letting pigs trample a neighbor's beans. These same courts heard pleas boundary disputes, trespass by cattle, slander, broken contracts, failure to repair hedges or ditches. A peasant did not have no rights. He or she had the right to bring a complaint, to answer one, to be immersed, fined according to custom rather than whim, and sometimes to challenge the immersement if it was excessive. Custom was a shield. Each manor possessed its own custumol, an unwritten memory sometimes copied into a book spelling out who owed what boon works at harvest, week work on a demesne, hens at Martinmas, eggs at Easter, cash rents commuted in place of labor, and limits on the Lord's demands. The phrase as the custom appears like a drumbeat in these records. If a steward tried to invent a new exaction or multiply old ones, tenants could and did protest that such demands were contrary to custom. They sometimes won. Even villains' unfree tenants had standing within this system because custom attached to the holding as much as to the person. Tenure created expectation. An expectation could be enforced in a court whose jurors were also one's neighbors. There were, of course, burdens that rubbed raw. Unfree tenants might owe merchet, a fine on marriage, heriot, the best beast upon death, chevage, a payment to live or work elsewhere, tallage, a discretionary tax levied on the unfree, but even these obligations had edges. Heriot was the best beast. Not any 3 the bailiff fancied. Merchet varied by estate and could be remitted. Tallage might be negotiated in a lump sum for an entire vill. The very fact that officials recorded and itemized such payments, beast, color, value made them contestable when abuse crept in. Beyond the manor, larger charters framed peasant life even if peasants never read them. The Charter of the Forest limited aristocratic appetites for woodlands by protecting common rights pasture, pannage for pigs, Eastover's firewood, and timber for repairs. Common was not a vague ideal. It was measured in gates and head counts and seasons, so many cattle on Lammas, so many swine when acorns dropped. To strip a community of its commons was to strip it of a survival. To defend them was to defend a social contract. The village's rights to turberry, cutting peat, houseboat and fireboat timber for house and fuel, and pasture were as real as a title deed, and just as jealously guarded. The myth also insists that peasants were glued to their birth soil. In practice, mobility existed and widened over time. Even villains traveled to nearby markets and annual fairs, to cart grain or wool, to hire themselves seasonally, to join pilgrimages that threaded Christendom. Permissions licentiae appear in court rolls for absences and employments. Fees were paid, yes, but the road was open. The proverb Stadtluft macht frei City, air makes free, belonged to Central Europe, where towns offered legal protections to long-term residents. In England and parts of France and Italy, chartered boroughs set their own courts and welcomed migrants into craft fraternities and wards. The peasants' world had horizons. They could be crossed, sometimes at cost, often with purpose, nor were peasants mute in the face of policy. When officials raised the price of labor or tried to freeze it, peasants heard the clink of chains in the numbers. After the Black Death thinned populations, survivors negotiated higher wages and shorter service to the fury of landlords. Statutes squeezed and sheriffs chased, but the market slipped the leash. Men and women walked to where pay was better, adopted cash tenures in place of labor, and quietly remade the economy from below. Revolt, like the Great Rising of 1381 in England, was the spectacular tip of a longer slope of bargaining. The rebels' petitions, written in clerks' hands but shaped by village voices, asked not for fantasy kingdoms, but for the end of serfdom dues, fair rents, and the removal of corrupt officials. They had a program because they already had a vocabulary of rights. It's easy to imagine lords as absolute in their own halls. Many were not. They, too, were threaded into obligations to kings, to creditors, to neighbors with teeth. Lords contracted with their tenants for carting and reaping, borrowed seed and cash, swore to uphold local customs when they acquired a manor, and found their bailiffs hauled before county courts when they did not. A powerful abbot might own dozens of manors, yet he still paid damages if his men diverted a stream or overreached on tolls. Law ran up as well as down, unevenly but perceptibly. In that very unevenness lay room to maneuver. Women appear in these records not only as defendants in ale cases, but as actors with property and voices. Widows claimed dower, daughters contested partitions, wives brewed, kept shops, and stood surety. In some regions, a widow could hold a vergate by the courtesy of the manor until a son came of age. Female tenants swore fealty, paid heriot, and presented nuisances alongside men. Their agency existed within constraints, but it was visible enough that officials wrote it down. None of this paints a golden countryside. Hunger landed often. Winter was a creditor who never forgave. Disease stalked in erratic waves. Violence could erase carefully tended rights in a single campaign season. And yet, for most days in most years, life was shaped not by arbitrary lashings, but by procedures flawed, local, negotiated. The same man who paid a heriot one autumn might the next spring present his lord's swineherd for letting hogs root in his oats and win a fine. The texture matters because it rescues medieval people from the caricature of passivity. A peasant knew where his strips lay in the open fields, which hedgerow marked the line to the neighbor's furlong, which days he owed the demesne, and which he kept for his own barley. When the assize would test his wife's ale, when the court met, who sat on the homage, and what could be said by custom, he might trudge home with a sore back, but also with a small victory a neighbor warned, a fine reduced, an amercement moderated at the poor man's request. These were not victories of headline scale. They were the punctuation marks of a life lived with some say, So the next time a scene paints medieval villagers as props, imagine instead the manorial bench under a sloped thatch, the jurors murmuring, the clerk scratching names in a margin, the reeve frowning over repairs to the mill sluice, a widow stepping forward to claim her right, a young couple paying merchet with coins saved over years, and then, because life insists, laughter outside when the pigs escape again. Power pressed down, but it met resistance in custom and community. Mud was real. So were the footprints peasants left in the record, arguing, bargaining, insisting that the world take their small claims seriously. Picture a castle, and most minds default to gray, rain-slick stone, soot-dark walls, a fortress so bleak even the torches look tired. That image owes more to centuries of weather and Victorian taste than to the Middle Ages themselves. Medieval castles were not born gray. They were finished in color, lime-washed to a bright glare, dressed in painted plasters, hung with riotous textiles, and strewn with tiles that flashed under candlelight. What time has scoured away, paper records and flecks of pigment in mortar quietly insist was once there. Start outside. Stone was rarely left raw if a lord could afford better. Lime wash, a slurry of slaked lime, sometimes tinted with earth pigments, sealed the walls against wind and rain and turned keeps into beacons. The White Tower in London was called that because it was whitewashed, a chalk-bright landmark on the Thames. Harlot towers in Scotland wore pale skins of lime and aggregate that could be finished with ochre, iron red, or a soft yellow. French fortresses carried coats that caught the sun from leagues away. A fresh wash did more than protect masonry. It advertised wealth. Color on a wall was labor, and labor meant rents paid. Tenants mustered, lime burned in great mounds, scaffolds raised and lowered. A castle that shone announced authority as surely as its crenellations did. Even naked stone could be tricked into warmth. Builders tinted mortars with ochres. Portals and window surrounds were picked out in contrasting colors so that entrances read bold from the bailey. Shields and painted boards studded the gatehouse like a living coat of arms. Banners dyed wool, painted linen, silk, if you could get it, broke the horizon above towers. On feast days, the sky itself seemed stitched to the roof line by pennons snapping in the wind. Step inside and the gray myth crumbles at the threshold. A great hall was the social engine of a castle, and it seldom resembled a cave. Walls were plastered smooth and painted. Fresco and secco layers ranged from simple bands of color to figurative schemes that climbed from wainscot to tie beam. Saints processed along one wall, hunting scenes galloped across another. Geometric diaper patterns quilted piers and responded to the geometry of the timber roof. The famous painted chamber at Westminster, a royal palace, not a castle, but of the same visual world, was only the most celebrated example of a broader habit to cover masonry with stories. Where paint did not reach, textiles did. Tapestries arras were portable walls, hauled from chest to latch by servants and draped so that color and narrative rolled down a room. They weren't only status symbols. Thick hangings trapped warmth, damped echoes, and hid the imperfections of lime behind embroidered paradise gardens and romances. Below them, benches and settles bore cushions covered in dyed cloth. Trestle tables wore linens. The high table blazed with plate and enamel. Even the floor joined the chorus. In wealthier residences, encaustic tiles, red, white, green set into checkered, and radial fields tested a steward's broom. In plainer spaces, fresh rushes scented with herbs, meadowsweet, lavender, mint were strewn, replaced on a schedule that reflected a household's pride. Woodwork worked hard at color. Beam ends and hammer posts were carved and painted. Bosses at the apex of vaults were gilded, where they caught the eyes of those who dared to look up during dinner. Chests and armoires wore coats of red and blue, stenciled with lilies or eagles or the owner's badge. Doors were no mere slabs, they were canvases. Traces of verdigris and cinnabar linger in the grain of surviving doors, like ghosts of feasts past. Candles woke those pigments at night, making rooms flicker as if they were alive, because they were. Light itself was colored. In chapels, often stitched to the keep or set like a jewel in the corner of a ward, glazed windows sifted daylight into pools of blue and ruby. Even domestic spaces sometimes had small panes set in lead cames, greenish and imperfect, honeycombing a bay. When the sun came, the room wore it. When the sun failed, sconces and iron chandeliers shattered flame across metal, textile and tile until the hall felt less like a bunker and more like a theater. It's true that not every castle had the means or the peace to maintain such a splendor at all times. Marcher fortresses in a season of raids could feel austere. Border towers quickly traded ornament for repairs, but principal seats and prosperous lordships invested in a spectacle. Color was part of defense of a softer kind, intimidation, persuasion, ritual. When envoys climbed the stair to a solar and found a room gilded with cloth of gold beneath painted beams, they negotiated under a ceiling that spoke before anyone else did. Archaeology supplies the receipts. Scratch a supposedly bare medieval wall and outflakes red iron oxide, carbon black, traces of blue. Peel back post-medieval plaster and you meet vine scrolls, figure fragments, lattices that once framed saints or lovers. In ruined halls, the mortar joints preserve ghost lines where arras rails ran. At sites where conservation has dared to reconstruct, where the interiors of royal halls have been repainted according to a surviving analysis, modern visitors often react with surprise bordering on disbelief. Too bright, they say, as if the past belongs to sepia. The past belonged to brightness when brightness was the language of power. Why then do we keep meeting castles in grayscale? Time is one culprit. Limewash chalks off in rain, paint succumbs to soot and smoke, tapestries rot and are cut into cushions, roofs fail and water rakes pigment from plaster. Reformation zeal, military sliding, modern neglect each stripped a layer. Antiquarians of the 18th and 19th centuries, allergic to gaudiness, took knives and lime to what remained. They preferred a noble ruin in honest stone to what they saw as medieval barbaric color. The taste stuck. Guidebooks spoke in a palette. They had inherited battles, blood, bare walls. Cinematographers learned to match it with lighting that made a stone weep. Money and meaning helped. Repainting is expensive. Interpreting color requires the humility to admit we have misremembered, but where we try, the Middle Ages look less alien and more human. People who lined their hearths with painted tiles and draped their walls with gardens were not cultivating misery. They were staging life. Courts sat in rooms that told them what justice should look like. Weddings unfolded beneath ceilings painted with heavens. Children learned their saints by walking a wall. A servant pulling the cords on a tapestry was also delivering a season's spring flowers in winter, summer hunts in Lent at the speed of fabric. Even the smell of color mattered. Glue-based paints, newly mixed, carried a tang. Waxed wood breathed out honey. Lime on fresh plaster soothed the damp. Historians can overdo the romance. There were drafts and lice and the smoke enough to teach tears to the eyes. But the blunt truth is that castles were not designed to be gray moral lessons. They were machines for authority and hospitality, and both worked better in color. So revise the stock image. Approach a keep that gleams pale against the weather. Pass banners at the gate that shout a lord's allegiances in vermilion and gold. Cross a threshold where walls breathe stories and the room answers your footsteps with tiles. Hear the chime of light through glass and the thrum of cloth on air. A castle could be a prison in a siege. On most days it was a stage, and the stages wear paint. The Black Death stalks the imagination like a shadow with a scythe. So it's no surprise one of the loudest myths says it killed half the world. That phrase lands well in a gasp, but it misses both scale and shape. The truth is already terrible enough in Europe between 1347 and 1351. Something like a third to perhaps 3/5 of the population died, numbers that varied wildly by town, valley, and year. But this was not a synchronized global die-off. Parts of the Middle East and North Africa suffered grievously. Swathes of Asia reeled. Other regions, most of sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas, Oceania, were untouched in that first pandemic wave. A catastrophe, yes. A universal extinction, no. If you were alive to see it arrive, you did not meet an abstraction. You met a sickness that moved along roads and along rumors, that rode in the belly of a ship and in a flea's bite. People did not know the name we give it now, Yersinia pestis, any more than they knew the word bacteria. But they named its faces, the one with the buboes, hard swellings that rose like purple fruit in the groin and armpit. The one of breath, where infection leapt from mouth to mouth and lungs drowned inside the rib cage. The sudden one, too fast to pray for, when fever and bleeding ended a life in a day. Today we sort these as bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. Then they were simply terror wearing different masks. It came into European ports along trade routes already old when the first carracks were caulked. Messina watched a dozen ghastly ships float in, crews dying at anchor. Genoa barred its harbor and still coughed. Marseille mourned until its church bells gave up. From the coasts, the sickness marched inland with pack trains and pilgrim feet, up river valleys and over passes. A given village might escape one year only to be hollowed the next. A city could endure a summer miracle and then fail in winter. The pattern was a patchwork, not a curtain. One monastery spared, another emptied, one manor stripped of tenants, a neighboring one merely thinned. And people tried. Medieval medicine is easy to caricature, yes. Someone somewhere strapped chickens to armpits, and more than one town set fires of herbs to sweeten air. But listen between the anecdotes and you hear systems straining to cope. City authorities hired rakers to cart bodies and to clean the streets. Confraternities established burial grounds outside walls, rows upon rows to keep pace with the days. Priests, physicians, and nurses moved from bed to bed until they could not. Some cities experimented with measures that would become the bones of public health guard stations on roads, bills of health at gates, rules that ships coming from bad air must stay apart for a span, a practice that would grow, in later outbreaks, into formal quarantine. It was imperfect and often too late, but it was not nothing. Human beings were trying to learn in the dark. Faith bent beneath the weight and then hardened into new shapes. In some places, processions wound through streets, candles guttering in wind, litanies for mercy rolling against shuttered houses. In others, fear looked for a human face to blame. Jewish communities already vulnerable were accused, tortured, expelled, and murdered in pogroms that stain the chronicles. Not every town succumbed to that frenzy. Some lords and councils defended their Jewish subjects, but enough did to leave ash in the record. To say the Middle Ages were only credulous is to forget both the hands that helped and the hands that harmed, and the way catastrophe amplifies whatever a society already is. When the first wave ebbed, the world did not simply resume itself as if a paused play had been restarted. It was altered, and not just in graveyards. Labor was suddenly scarce. A plow still needed hands, a mill still needed a miller, a city still needed porters and weavers and the women who brewed and baked. Wages rose where they could. Lords and councils pushed back where they dared. In England, the Crown issued the Statute of Laborers to clamp pay to pre-plague levels, proof that the market had shifted even if the law pretended it had not. Some serfs slipped away to better terms elsewhere. Some villages died quietly, their fields taken back by wood and bramble. Some town offered citizenship to anyone with craft enough to fill a gap. The economy did not collapse into permanent ruin. It rebalanced, often ruthlessly, and the pivot advantaged those nimble or lucky enough to seize it. Culture turned, too, and in it you can feel both grief and a sharpened appetite for this life. Church art filled with images of the dance of death, a chain where popes and princes, laborers and ladies stepped hand in hand toward the grave, a grim democracy. Tombs sprouted transy effigies, carved bodies not in their prime but as bones and drying skin, candor in a stone. And yet feasts resumed, guilds commissioned altarpieces more lavish than before. The business of getting married and christening children went on with a certain defiance. It was as if the age had learned a lesson it could not afford to keep always in mind that everything is fragile, and therefore everything's precious. Half the world evaporates as a phrase when you stand very close to one window. Here is a ledger from a Florentine household. 3 apprentices crossed out in a week. The margin notes God received them. Here's a rural parish in Normandy. Baptisms ceased for a season and then resume with a flurry, as if a bell had been lifted from the land. Here is Cairo, where a scholar writes of judges dying faster than they can be replaced, and markets roaring back as soon as they do. Here is a hamlet that vanishes from a tax roll, not because an empire ended, but because 20 people somewhere turned their faces to the wall within the same fortnight. Nor was 1351 the end. the plague returned in waves for centuries, sometimes muttering, sometimes shouting. Local experience is stratified by class and by luck. A noble might flee to a country seat. A weaver could not. A village midwife came the difference between a line vanishing and a line continuing. But the stereotype of a world that fell all at once and forever is a neatness the past refuses. The 14th century endured, adjusted, and then rolled forward with new guild ordinances, new inheritance disputes, new poems, new saints' days, new lawsuits about hedges because, even after a cataclysm, ordinary life insists on itself. Under the hood of numbers is a more expensive truth. We reach for half the world because it feels proportional to our sense of horror, and because it turns complexity into a single dramatic stroke. But history rarely pays out in simple ratios. It pays out in textures, the way a city smells when wagons of quicklime pass, the sound of a shutter closing when someone coughs, the rasp of a pen as a clerk writes in a margin that this tenant is dead and that field is free. It pays out in the touch of resilience, ugly and beautiful by turns laws that try to fix time to yesterday's prices, weddings that pulse as if tomorrow were guaranteed, and art that tells you, candidly, that tomorrow never is. So keep the dread accurate, which is to say, human-sized and therefore overwhelming. No, the Black Death did not kill half the world. It did, however, pull Europe's ribs apart and a squeeze, hard enough that even today we can hear the breath leave the body in the records. And when the breath came back, it came back changed, dearer, riskier, more aware of its own warmth. That, finally, is the shape of it. If you let the movies guide you, every medieval lawsuit ends with two men in a muddy field swinging a steel until one stops moving. Rain, drums, a crowd that thirsts for verdicts and blood in equal measure. Trial by combat becomes the courthouse, the clerk, and the judge all at once. It's a compelling picture, but it's also a poor guide to how most justice was done. Combat was real, yes, recognized in law across swaths of Europe, but it was exceptional, bounded by rules, and increasingly rare as the centuries wore on. Most quarrels were settled with oaths and witnesses, fines and charters, not with blunted teeth and a split helm. Imagine first the thing it was meant to replace, not evidence, but unknowable truth. In a world anxious about perjury and planted testimony, divine judgment could feel cleaner than human conjecture. If God ran the universe, then surely God could tilt an outcome, just as he made crops grow and armies scatter. That belief powered ordeals with iron and water, and in a narrower set of cases, judicial duels, but even the believers hedged. They wrapped combat in procedure, like a fragile object in cloth. You didn't simply shout combat in a marketplace and start swinging. A court had to grant it, and not every court would. The challenger declared his accusation formally. The accused replied and could refuse under certain circumstances. Sometimes champions were hired to fight in a principal's stead, especially when one party was elderly, infirm, or a woman. Weapons and armor were specified in advance, the field staked out with markers, the judges set rules, time limits, prohibited tricks, agreed signals of submission. In many jurisdictions, the fight ended not in death, but in yielding a palm laid flat, a word spoken, a finger lifted toward a sky, The fiction divine judgment remained, but the practice bent toward containment. The famous outliers float to the top precisely because they were unusual. In France, the 1386 combat between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris, the one remembered as the last duel, was sensational enough to pack Paris with the spectators and to pull princes into the lodges. It was a capital case, a charge of rape aggravated by the honor of great households, the kind of thing that turned legal process into a pageant. Yet the reason it looms so large is that, by the late 14th century, the very spectacle was the exception. A legal muscle, once flexed freely, had stiffened from disuse. Across the channel, the duel lounged on in the books longer than in life. English common law never quite burned it out. It lingered as a dusty option, invoked so rarely that when a clever defendant in 1817, centuries after plate armor had gone to museums, demanded his right to it, Parliament hurried to sweep the anachronism away. That last flicker tells you more about inertia than about medieval habit. Statutes can keep a customs corpse warm for a very long time. Walk down the social ladder and the field clears. Villagers fought over hedges and pigs, water rights and insults, but they mostly fought with words before a manorial court, or with arbitration in a parish hall, or with fines that bruised the purse more than the ribs. Compurgation, the taking of oaths by one's neighbors to shore up credibility, sounds alien to us, but it functioned as a community's memory. If you were known to be honest, people swore to it. If you were known to be a cheat, the room cooled. That kind of justice depends on entanglement. Everyone knows everyone and remembers last year's barley yield and who borrowed whose ox. A duel would have been theatrical in such a setting and wasteful. Nor did judicial combats spiral into melee. The German lands, where the fetched Bücher fight books anatomized technique with a scholar's care, did host judicial fights governed by regional custom, but those same treatises are the best evidence that these were stylized affairs, with the standardized weapons, longsword, mace, shield, and prescribed openings. In some towns, civil disputes could be decided with a limited bout, first blood or a fall, a thing closer to sport than to slaughter. Guild statutes, not God's hand, kept the peace most days. The church's posture mattered as well. When the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 forbade clergy to bless ordeals, it squeezed one artery of divine judgment, combat, which sat nearby on the map of ideas, found its oxygen thinning. Local traditions did not vanish overnight. Custom resists decrees like an old oak resists wind, but the tide ran against procedures that leaned on miracles. Gradually, inquisitorial methods, record-keeping, and a slow professionalization of law crept forward. Lay courts learned to prefer parchments to pikes. This doesn't mean the duel had no bite. In the right political weather, when great men needed theater, when an accusation could not be washed away by quieter means, the field was irresistible. A prince could turn one day's combat into a civic catechism. See how order reigns, see how justice is visible, see how honor wears our colors, and at the margins, in borderlands where state power thinned, private combats feuds dressed in legal costume flared like brush fires, but even those cases were bounded by calculation. A noble risked his life when the odds suited him. He paid a fine when they did not. The myth persists because it makes judgment legible. We like verdicts we can see. Papers and oaths feel pale next to a lance point and a body falling. Put two armored figures in a chalked circle, and the mind understands this is a story. It will end. The real medieval story is untidier. It is a reeve tallying damages for trampled rye, a borough court recording that Thomas, son of Allen, is immersed, a notary writing out a concord while two neighbors glare and sign. It is 100 small settlements and a handful of fights, not the other way around. And if you need one more reason to distrust the cinematic duel, consider the audience. Medieval crowds were hungry for a spectacle tournaments, saints' days, executions on the hill. When a judicial combat was granted, the city flocked to it the way a town flocks to fireworks. Chroniclers lingered over such days because they were bright. But a record that glows does not tell you how often the lamp was lit. For most plaintiffs and defendants, justice did not blaze, it plodded. So keep the duel, but put it where it belongs on the shelf, with rare procedures taken down when the ordinary ones failed, or when power wanted theater. Between the writ and the witness, the oath and the fine, there was sometimes a field and a pair of men in harness. They fought within lines etched by law, and when they were done, the law went back to its ledger. Justice, like war, is more bureaucracy than battle most of the time. The mud and the metal make better cinema. The minutes of the court tell the truth. If you picture medieval medicine as a monk with a bucket of leeches and a prayer for the best, you miss the busy rooms where care was a craft, the clink of mortars in an apothecary's shop, the hush of a ward where sisters changed dressings by lamplight, the crackle of a cautery iron followed by the measured pour of wine to cleanse a wound. The Middle Ages could be credulous. Yes, astrology on the calendar, humors in the textbook, but they were not medically illiterate. They worked with the tools they had, learned from those who wrote before them, and, more often than our caricatures allow, improved the patient in front of them. Begin with the backbone of theory, the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, an inheritance from Hippocrates and Galen. Diagnose imbalance, restore balance. It was an elegant map, and like many elegant maps, wrong in essentials yet useful enough to guide care. Bloodletting and leeches have become the punchline, but they were only one instrument in a crowded chest. A physician might prescribe a regimen long before a lancet: air and sleep, diet and movement, baths and temperate wine. Whole poems were written to fix the rules in memory, the regimen of Salerno ringing like a health manual in verse, advising when to rise, what to eat with what, which seasons demanded caution. Step into a hospital and you meet another truth. These were not laboratories of modern surgery, but they were not charnel houses either. In Paris, at the Hôtel Dieu, in London, at St. Bartholomew's, in towns and abbeys across Europe, religious houses ran institutions for the sick poor: food, clean linen, a roof away from drafts, a hand to turn the fevered, simple interventions that saved lives. Nuns learned to compound ointments and syrups. Brothers kept inventories of herbs, sage, rue, fennel, and of Presier imports like cinnamon and ginger brought along the same roots that carried silks and stories. Care was wrapped in prayer, but it was also wrapped in competence. On the street, medicine wore many faces. University-trained physicians, men of Paris, Bologna, Montpellier, diagnosed by pulse and urine charts. The color and scent of the patient's water mapped to a wheel of conditions. Apothecaries ground and weighed. Their drawers held willow bark for pain, mint and anise for the stomach, aloe for the skin, myrrh for wounds. Barber surgeons worked with steel-pulling teeth, setting bones, lancing abscesses, trimming lifeless flesh from ragged injuries. Between these worlds walked midwives, the most experienced hands many women would ever know, carrying knowledge passed from mentor to apprentice, sometimes praised, sometimes harried by authorities who wanted their signatures on births and their say on baptisms. Surgery, more than we like to admit, could be rational. Battlefield manuals advised washing wounds with wine, its alcohol, and antiseptic before the word existed, then stitching and binding with clean linen. Theodoric Borgognoni, a 13th century surgeon, argued against the old delight in laudable puce, preferring to keep wounds clean and closed. Guy de Chauliac, in the 14th century, pulled together a lifetime of practice in his Great Surgery, describing hernias and fractures, trepanation and cataracts. None of it is modern. Much of it is hard to read without wincing, but the impulse is empirical. Watch what works. Write it down, teach it forward. Even anesthesia, in some form, existed. Soporific sponges, linen soaked in wine infused with opium, henbane, and mandrake were held to a patient's nose to dull pain and soften panic before a knife went in. It was blunt, dangerous, and sometimes fatal, yet it marks a refusal to treat suffering as irrelevant. Medieval surgeons knew pain was a problem. They worked to lessen it with the pharmacopoeia they had. There were also blind corners. Astrology yoked itself to the clinic. A physician might time a bleeding to the moon's position, or avoid cutting when Mars glared from a certain house. Urine divination could drift into performance. A charm might be whispered over a poultice, not as a substitute for the herbs, but as a hedge of blessing. From the perspective of centuries, we roll our eyes, but examine the record carefully and you find the ratio matters for every talisman, a recipe for every star chart, a list of simples and their doses. The traffic of knowledge ran both east and west. Arabic and Persian scholars preserved and expanded Greek medicine when Latin Europe's libraries were thin. Through Sicily, Spain, and southern Italy, translators carried Avicenna and Al-Zahrawi into Latin, the canon of medicine, with its calm taxonomy of disease, the surgical compendium with its drawings of hooks and cauteries. In Salerno, the most cosmopolitan of Europe's early medical schools, women appear in the texts, the figure we conventionally call trotula, advising on childbirth, uterine disorders, and cosmetics with a specificity that sounds like practice, not theory. Hildegard of Bingen wrote Physica, a herbal among many other things, weaving observation into a theology of nature. It is not our science, but it is not superstition alone. Dissection tentatively entered the universities in the 13th and 14th centuries. At Bologna, a winter's cold helped preserve a cadaver long enough for the students to crowd the benches, while a lector matched text to flesh, and a surgeon's assistant did the cutting. The work was more demonstration than discovery. cautious and pious, but it pushed against taboo. Bones were handled, organs were named, errors in the ancient texts were whispered and slowly corrected. Such classes did not fill cities with anatomists, they did plant a seed. Public health flickers to life in the record with every disaster. When plague arrived, cities experimented, quarantines, lazarettos, inspectors to track ships and travelers, too little, too late, often, but the first rough drafts of bureaucratic response. Town statutes regulated butchers and tanners, ordered waste, moved outside the walls, tried to keep water clean. You can watch civic pride grow a conscience. Disease is not only a judgment, it is a management problem. Of course, there were failures, and of a kind that make us wince. Purges and emetics were overused. Mercury crept into ointments. A mother might be told to wear a relic against a fever, when what she needed was clean water and time. The record is full of patients who suffered longer than they should have. It is also full of patients who healed in the care of people who, in a world without microscopes, learned to trust wine over water in a wound, to stitch rather than leave gashes open, to pack honey into cuts where its sugars discouraged rot, and always there is the ordinary day, which never makes the chronicles, a child's fractured wrist splinted and bound, a tooth eased from infected gum, a cataract couched with a needle so that light returns, milky and miraculous, to a farmer's eye. A midwife kneels, breathes, and turns a stuck shoulder at the right moment so that a baby slips free and lives. A sister wipes a fevered brow and then replaces the linens because she has learned that clean cloth matters as much as prayer. So keep the leech. If you must, it belonged to the kit, and sometimes, by luck or physiology, helped, but set it on a bench beside the scalpel and the spoon, the glass urinal and the herbal, the wine jug and the needle. Medieval medicine was a ladder built from memory, observation, and habit. Some rungs were rotten, some were surprisingly strong. Between the charm and the chart, the rosary and the regimen, you can see the shape that would become our science imperfect eyes watching carefully, hands learning what mercy felt like when it was practical, and minds willing slowly, unevenly to change. If you go by the grim shorthand, medieval life was bare earth and bad luck punctuated by bells for funerals. Yet open a parish account book or a guild ordinance, listen to a carol copied in a margin, or stand in the footprint of a vanished fairground, and a noisier, brighter world steps forward. People laughed, schemed, flirted, played, ate better than stereotypes allow, and spent no small part of the year making room for joy. The calendar itself insisted on it. Between Sundays, saints' days, vigils, and local feasts, the average village kept dozens of holidays' holy days when work slowed or stopped. At Christmas, greenery climbed door frames. At Candlemas, light returned to houses in pooled wax. At Easter, processions moved through lanes that smelled of bread. May Day crowned a queen of the village and raised a pole ribboned like a summer sky. Corpus Christi unfurled guild pageants through town shipwrights, rolled a Noah's Ark. Bakers staged the Last Supper on a wheeled stage. Smiths hammered sparks into the dark of hell's mouth, while children squealed at the smoke. The Feast of Fools, often scolded by clergy and loved by everyone else, inverted hierarchies for a day laughter licensed. Solemnity lampooned. Music threaded all of it. A piper could be hired with a jug of ale. A fiddler vielle on his knee stitched steps together for line dances in the street. In manor halls, harps and rebecks shadowed voices. In taverns, drums and the drone of bagpipes drove unstomping feet across rush-strewn floors. Songs survived because people remembered them. Carols with round refrains you could sing in parts. Work songs for scything. Lullabies that softened the wolf-lean months. The instruments were not delicate museum pieces. They were tools, mended and played hard, passed from hand to hand like stories. Sport was not a spectator luxury. It was a civic chore and a pleasure. In England, kings ordered archery practice on Sundays, not because it was quaint, but because a realm's defense depended on bowstrings and shoulders that could bear them. On village greens, men shot at butts for small stakes and large pride. Football, closer to a moving scrum than to any modern code, chased a bladder ball down lanes until dusk or someone got hurt enough to stop the match. Wrestling, quarterstaff bouts, and throwing the hammer filled fairs with cheers. Women played too. In games, we still recognize a stool ball, a cousin to cricket, pitch and toss, and a snowball fight that got out of hand and ended in laughter or the stocks, depending on the constable. Inside, when weather pinned people to hearts, board games came out. Chess arrived early, changed to fit Christian sensibilities, and colonized noble tables. 9 men's Morris and backgammon spread across classes. Dice clicked in alehouses, sometimes illegally, after curfew, while a storyteller traded a tale for a mug. Cards, latecomers, found an eager public. Patterns traveled with peddlers and soldiers, suits shifting names as they crossed frontiers. Gambling laws existed because people gambled. Bans on night play existed because people stayed up too late. Food was not a monochrome gruel. The poor had lean seasons. No romantic gloss can change that, but even peasant diets could be varied when harvests were kind and commons were intact. Pottage might be thickened with peas and leeks, salted pork yielding its fat into the pot. Oatcakes and rye loaves bulked meals. Cheese anchored breakfast. Eggs brightened feast days. Town markets brought fish fresh and smoked, eels from rivers, nuts, apples, and honey. Fairs added almonds, raisins, and the occasional luxury, a twist of sugar, a scrap of saffron for a wedding loaf. In wealthy houses, cooks staged edible theater swan refeathered. After roasting, subtleties molded in marchpane, sauces sweet-sour with prunes and wine. Spices spoke of ports and purses, yes, but also of taste, a liking for heat and perfume that surprises modern palates used to salt and pepper's a shy duet. Work filled most days. The point is that it did not erase pleasure. A harvest might bring the whole village to a field reaping, binding, stacking, and end with an ale given by the Lord as custom, music on the green, and a goose set to roast at someone's only oven. A building campaign for a new nave or bridge tied community to a shared task and a shared pride. Guilds policed standards, trained apprentices, buried members, and feasted with enough pomp to irritate neighbors. Even quarrels ended in ritual reconciliations, a public handshake after a fine, bread and wine shared to cool a feud. Love and its theatrics were not inventions of the Renaissance. Troubadour poetry wandered north and inward, translated into tongues that could carry size as well as statutes. Marriage matches ranged from strategically arranged to stubbornly chosen, and the records of consistory courts where the church judged marital disputes are crowded with the busy grammar of desire and disappointment. Charivaris noisy mock parades police behavior with pans and jeers. Yes, but they also affirmed that a community cared enough to scold. Affection lived behind shutters and in the open ring tokens traded. Favors knotted at tournaments, a bench in a church porch with initials cut by a knife a century before you were born. Art and color mattered. The gray we see in ruined stone is the ghost of a gaudier skin. Churches were painted floor to vault saints in vermilion and lapis, devils a cheerful green, stars pricked onto deep blue night. Townhouses wore lime wash in creams and pinks, beams were picked out in reds, shop signs swung with painted beasts. Clothing coarsely woven or richly dyed told the eye about status and taste. A laborer's hood might be madder dyed, a wife's best kirtle might flash a yellow lining when she turned. Even sumptuary laws, those fretful lists of who may wear what, testify to a populace that liked to show off. It is true that fear and grief sat close by. Plague rolled in black waves, harvests failed, war took sons and stores. But the persistence of festivals in plague years, of marriages inked after bad harvests, of guild feasts resumed after truces, tells you what people chose when they could choose to meet, to eat together, to dance if there was a pipe, to put color on walls and names on cups. The bells in towers counted deaths. They also called neighbors to watch a play where God was a craftsman and time began on a cart that smelled of sawdust and glue. The stereotype of the perpetually downtrodden medieval everyman shuffles past all days because it is easier to imagine a single mood than to admit a complicated one. But the records that survive ordinances about when the piper must stop, licenses for innkeepers to sell hot pies, fines for throwing snowballs at the beetles, payments to repair the maypole, ink-blotted lists of prizes for archery butts, a clerk's careful note of 24 small candles for the play refused to flatten. They testify to a people who worked hard and carved out the space to be human together. So when we picture the period, let the shadows stand, the cold rooms, the long winters, the bad years, but light the candles too. Hear the drumskin tighten in a warm palm, the laugh at a clumsy actor in a devil's mask, the whistle of an arrow that thuds into a painted ring and wins a ribbon. Smell bread and ale and the sweet scorch of a roast spitting fat. See a village green in late sun, scuffed by dances. You can still learn if someone counts you in. Life was not a line of sorrows. It was a braid labor, worship, appetite, relief plaited anew each season by hands that knew what to do when the pipe began. Across the Mongolian steppe, where the horizon is so wide it seems to unspool the sky, the dust of a single rider means more than travel. It is a request, a test, and if the old people are right, a visitation from the eternal blue sky itself. For centuries, Mongols have spoken of guests as if they were sent by Tengri, the spirit of the heavens. That belief is not piety stapled onto custom. It is how you survive a country where a wrong wind can kill, and a stretch of empty miles can be the longest thing a human being ever faces. Hospitality here is not graciousness in the drawing room sense. It is law older than cons, older than script. When the hoofbeats come closer and the outline of a horse and rider thickens in the heat tremble, life in the ger shifts. Someone steps outside and raises a hand in greeting, never hurrying, never shouting. The door flap is lifted. The rider is invited to dismount. A rein is taken. A quiet signal your animal is safe. Therefore, you are safe. In a land of distances, that is the first and deepest kindness. Why this formality? Because the steppe remembers. It remembers winters when a night without shelter turned a man stiff as his saddle. It remembers sandstorms that stripped warmth and direction from the world. Denying a traveler food and a place by the hearth is not a stinginess. Here it is a kind of murder. So the rule runs the other way, whether the stranger is kin, a trader, a wandering singer with a cracked lute, or even someone whose cousins once raided your horses. The door opens. Protection lasts as long as the guest remains under your roof. Once he leaves, old quarrels may resume. Within the circle of felt and esteem, they are set aside. The ger becomes holy ground. This code has a theology behind it and a logic. The theology says that the hearth's smoke climbs to the sky and carries prayers with it. To warm a traveler at that fire is to make the gods witness to your good name. The logic says reputations travel faster than caravans. A generous household acquires a second skin of stories that move ahead of it like a standard in battle. On the steppe, such stories are currency. A man's herd can be lost to a winter. His name, once made, can carry his children. The choreography of welcome is plain and precise. The guest is seated in the place of honor north, facing the door, with the fire between him and the wind. Weapons are laid where all can see, and none will touch. A bowl is offered with 2 hands for safety's sake and because that is how you receive anything you mean to keep. The first mouthful is usually arag, fermented mare's milk, whose sour edge can surprise the unprepared. To refuse the bowl is to refuse the bond. Even enemies drink. Bread follows curds, a strip of dried meat. Whatever the season allows, conversation comes last, and it begins with weather and herds, because to ask first about business is to value silver over shelter. There is a dignity in this slowness. It calms the dust and the heartbeat. It gives the host time to look at the cut of the guest's coat, the nicks on his stirrup, the state of his horse's mane, to read a whole diary without a question asked. It gives the guest a chance to notice where the tea brick sits, how full the salt jar is, whether the boot rack by the door holds 4 pairs or 10. A household's wealth and worries are not hidden on the steppe. They are arranged, like everything else, around the fire. The custom is strict, but it is not stiff. A child will steal a look at the visitor and be waved over, scolded gently for staring, then pressed to offer bread. Old women, who have seen enough winters to speak like queens, will ask the questions. Young men hesitate too. Where are you from? Whose son are you? How many mares are you milking this summer? There is laughter when the guest says he has lost count, and a softening when he says he buried a brother last year. Hospitality here makes room for grief as well as hunger, because refusal is unthinkable. Extravagance is measured. A household gives what it can without crippling itself. In spring, When the herds are thin, there may be milk and little more. In autumn, when the animals are fat, a guest might arrive to find a stones heating in the fire for korkog, mutton cooked with the stones locked inside a pot until the meat falls under its own weight. The season adds its own flavor to courtesy. In winter, the guest sits close to the hearth, and the talk shortens because the wind outside is a better storyteller than anyone inside. In summer, the door is a bright square, and the gear fills with the buzz of insects and the sound of a boy thwacking a mare's flank until the milk foams. None of this excludes calculation. The generosity that keeps strangers alive also keeps enemies cautious. A man you have fed may still raid your herd. He will do it if he does it elsewhere. A man who owes you a night's warmth thinks twice before drawing a bowstring your way. And if he proves faithless, your complaint is not merely personal, it is cosmic. He has broken with the house and with the sky. On a plain with no courts and no walls, such indictments matter. Travelers from beyond the grasslands have been bewildered and steadied by this. A Persian envoy writes down the order in which bowls were offered and believes he has found a code. A Chinese official, used to gates and seals, watches a boy lead away his horse as if it were the simplest thing, and something inside him loosens. A Venetian merchant memorizes the taste of sour milk and repeats the story of a night spent in a round house where no one asked his price until morning. The Estep dunes these men into a single shape, someone who needed a door and found it open. Hospitality bleeds into politics almost without noticing. Alliances begin with meat and end with promises. Feuds are cooled with a second helping. Even the Khans recognized that some treaties could be written into bellies more securely than onto parchment. Hostile embassies were permitted to arrive as guests and depart still breathing. The quarrel preserved for the field rather than the doorway. A clever chief could buy time with a pot of tea and the sight of fat foals in a summer paddock. A foolish one could squander friends with tight cups and a stingy hand. The Estep teaches that power is not only the strength of your riders, but the remembered taste of your table. Etiquette fixes the edges of this mercy. Step on a gear's threshold and you have insulted the house. Point your feet at the hearth and you have insulted the fire. Touch another's head and you have overreached. Keep your knife out unless the host asks for it. Accept the pipe even if you do not smoke. Take a mouthful even if you do not drink. Praise the horse even if you know it is tired. These are small stitches, but they hold the fabric. Break enough of them, and even a god might not recognize you. Perhaps the clearest proof that this code is older than memory is how easily it extends to time itself. Stories are told as if the dead might arrive any evening and expect a seat, an ancestor who rode with the great Khan, a cousin swallowed by a snowstorm, an enemy who happened to arrive on the one day you slaughtered a sheep. Their names are folded into the jokes and the parables. Treat him as we treated Batu's man the year the foals were late, someone says, and the household knows exactly what degree of welcome is meant. In a world of asphalt and hotel keys, such rules can read like romance. They are nothing of the sort. They are the most practical thing in a landscape that punishes pride. They say you might be me tomorrow. They say the sky sees. They say there will be a night when the only light you find is the oval of a door you did not know, and someone inside must choose. On the step, the choice has already been made. The hand goes up, the flap lifts, a bowl is filled until it threatens to spill. Drink, the host says, and means live. The estate looks empty until you learn to read it. A distant smudge is not just dust. It is a caravan shaking out into single file, an embassy cresting the light. The Mongols always knew what the outside world often forgot theirs was not a wilderness, but a crossroads. Silk Road traders, Persian secretaries, Tangut monks, Chinese astronomers, even the rare, sunburned European, sooner or later, they all arrived at a felt door with the wind at their backs, blinking into warmth. And wherever they came from, they were treated first as guests, not puzzles to solve or threats to weigh. The code was older than any Khan and as stronger than suspicion. For the stranger, the choreography was both bewildering and steadying. The door flap lifted, a hand calloused, unhurried, took the reins. Horse first, then rider. Inside, the guest was shown the northern place, facing the door and the world he had just crossed. Weapons stayed in sight, but at rest, a quiet pact. A bowl appeared, held in both hands arag, the sour, chilled tang of fermented mare's milk. A man from the Levant might flinch at the first sip. A scribe from the Yellow River might cough, but neither would refuse. To drink was to accept the shelter of the fire and, with it, the obligations that knit host and guest together for as long as that roof held. The sequence of offerings did its own speaking. First, the arag, to cool the road from the tongue and declare, without a word, that the visitor had crossed into safety, then bread and curds, the reliable staples that signaled steadiness, not show. If the household was flush and the season kind, meat followed mutton boiled to tenderness, or the stones heated red and locked into an iron vessel for korkog until the bone gave way to thumb's pressure. In winter, when milk thinned and travel could kill, the bowls filled with salty milk tea, heavy with butter. No one counted cups. The host refilled before the guest could ask. The guest took a mouthful, even if his stomach argued, because politeness was not form, it was glue. Language mattered less than the order of things. A Persian envoy could praise the horse with hands and eyes. A Uyghur clerk could touch the rim of the bowl in thanks. Children ferried bread. An elder woman's silver hair braided, eyes sharp from a lifetime of reading weather, asked the questions that placed a stranger in the world whose child, which river, how many mares stand in milk this summer. Names were spoken as if tying knots. The gur was a map, and the meal the legend that explained it. From these gestures, politics spreads like heat. The Mongols practiced diplomacy by firelight. Letters had their place, wax seals, and clever scribes traveled with the postal relays, but bonds that mattered were tasted, not stamped. When the time came to talk of past injuries or future ventures, no one hurried. Ancestors were praised. The wind was discussed. The herds, the foals, the wolves that had prowled last week. The conversation edged toward the thing itself only when the bowls had gone around enough times to make the ground feel steady underfoot for everyone in the room. If the matter was serious, the welcome became its spectacle. Horseflesh is wealth on the steppe, and to slaughter a horse is to burn a coin in the open air. A wise host did it, knowing exactly what message it sent. The gur was dressed, carpets beaten, cushions fattened, the best wooden bowls and silver-lined ladles brought out of chests. Meat arrived in generous cuts. Knives were passed so the guests could carve for themselves. Cups were refilled before they emptied. In the pauses, the host recounted a bravery from the visitor's lineage, a story heard from men who ride far, laying flattery like a plank across a gap. No parchment can make a man feel seen. A well-timed memory can. Gifts were the grammar of this language. A guest might leave tea bricks, fine thread, a bit of Persian sugar wrapped against the damp, or a knife with a good temper, small tokens, given not as payment but as acknowledgement that generosity had been met with attention. A host, for his part, might send a visitor out with a lamb tied behind the saddle, or a felt pad folded tight against the saddle bow, or simply a blessing that named the road ahead and wished it gentle. Reputation clung to these exchanges. A poor household might offer only thin milk and a place by the hearth. If it did so with a full heart, word went out that it was rich in the right way. Enemies crossed the same threshold and were treated the same way. This was not naivety. The law of hospitality suspended all the counts without erasing them. For a night or three, the past set its weapons down. A man whose cousins had stolen your yearlings might still sit in the honorable place. You would still place the bowl in his hands. If he ate and slept under your roof and then rode out to raid you the next week, the offense doubled. He had broken with your fire and with the sky that watched you both. The steppe has few walls and fewer judges. Honor does the policing. A man's name can outrun his horse. Travelers wrote the record in their own way. A Persian notes the order of dishes and the ease with which the women of the household command the space. A Chinese envoy, used to corridors and gates, marvels that a boy takes his horse without permission, asked and feels, to his surprise, relief. A Venetian, his belly uncertain, his head thick with dust, remembers that no one spoke of silver until morning, and that when they did, the numbers felt less like a trap than a proposition, because they had been softened by tea, by meat, by jokes he only half understood, but understood enough. Beyond the single door, the empire knitted this custom into its arteries. The yam, the relay network of post stations, offered fodder, fresh mounts, bowls of tea, and sometimes a short sleep to couriers, carrying orders like sparks between camps. The same law applied. You feed the rider, you water the horse. Messages made the estate, but meals kept it humane. A relay captain with a tight hand on supplies could slow an army. One with a generous ladle could make an hour feel like a mercy large enough to be remembered. Of course, calculation thrummed under the generosity. Hosts took stock. Guests did too. The arrangement of saddles by the door told a sly-eyed envoy how many men were home. The depth of the milk pail told him more. A clever guest praised the foals, asked after the wolves, and gauged the mood before suggesting anything sharper than a proverb. A clever host kept the bowls in motion until he saw how far the stranger could be moved and how far he would not. The steppe teaches patience. A rushed bargain is as foolish as a forced march in a blizzard. What held the whole exchange together were the taboos that framed it. Do not step on the threshold. This is the edge between worlds. Do not put your feet toward the fire. This is the house's spirit. Not a thing to be pointed at. Do not fiddle with a knife uninvited. Do not refuse the bowl. These seem small until you see what happens when one is broken. The air goes tight. Conversation thins to thread. The host may smooth it with a joke, or an elder might cough and reshape the moment. But a line has been smudged, and everyone feels it. In a land where survival is a shared project, etiquette is not decoration. It is architecture. In all this, there's a quiet brilliance. The Mongols turned a necessity into art, and art into policy. They made the world not with gates, but with doors, and used the table to do what other peoples tried to do with fortresses and ink. The memory of a warm gur in hard weather can redirect a caravan next season, can soften an envoy's report, can make a wary chieftain decide that this alliance is tolerable, that one raid can wait. On the steppe, a decision is rarely made in one stroke. It is brewed like tea until the fat rises. And when the stranger rose to go belly full, eyes clearer than when he arrived, the goodbye was as spare as the welcome. Hands clasped, a blessing is spoken toward the road rather than at the man. A boy brought the horse. Someone checked the girth. A woman tucked a scrap of bread into the guest's hand without a word. Outside, the sun made the grass 1,000 small mirrors. The rider turned once at the door, nodded, and became again a smudge in the distance. Inside, the bowls were stacked, the fire was banked, and the house returned to itself with the easy satisfaction of a custom fulfilled. The story would travel with him. Names gallop here, and kindness keeps pace. The steppe keeps its own calendar, measured not in dates, but in the taste of the air and the way horses move. Hospitality moves with it. What is set before a stranger in July is not what warms him in January. And the difference isn't simply pantry stock, it is philosophy, tuned to weather. Summer is the season of ease. Foals wobble after mares. Milk runs plentiful and sweet. A guest arrives to a ger whose door flap is thrown high for the breeze. Dust tamped with a splash from a leather bucket. Children carry in wooden bowls that sweat with cold arog, the fermented tang made gentler with the day's froth. Dairy takes the lead, thick clotted cream spooned with ceremony. Curds soft enough to spread with the back of a knife. Fresh cheese still tasting faintly of grass. Meat, when it comes, is tenderness rather than proof quick boils. Slices taken from a leg hung in the shade. The talk runs long because the sun does. Stories unspool, interrupted by horses snorting at fly whisks and the slap of a mat being shaken outside. A man rides away at dusk, a little drunk on milk and ease, and the side of grass laid out like sea. Autumn remembers that ease is rented, not owned. Herds grow heavy, knives work at a measured pace. The guest may smell the iron before he sees it, the great cauldron brought out for Korkog. Stones heated until they sing. Meat and onion sealed in with a lid that buckles under a steam. When the pot opens, faces lean into the cloud, fingers slick with fat, will lift the stones themselves and roll them in their palms to chase the ache out of knuckles. Bread is thicker now, fried pieces bortsog, set to drain on cloth. cooling into a chew that carries a hint of honey if the house is lucky. Tea darkens, salted and heavy with butter. The first cool wind draws everyone closer to the fire. The conversation shifts accordingly. There is counting of lambs, of mares, of wolves seen and traps set. Plans fold into the talk like knives into sheaths. A visitor is fed, and, in being fed, also enlisted, he carries away the arithmetic of a household, the quiet broadcast of a strength that autumn prefers to shout. Then winter comes, uncomplicated and absolute. The door flap lifts on a slice of white and sound wind dragging its nails across the felt, hooves ringing hard as a stone, a rider whose eyelashes crust with rime. A guest in winter is not an interruption, he is an imperative. Hospitality tightens, it is stripped to the bone. Milk thins, so bowls brim with a sute tsai, the salty tea that behaves like soup butter to carry heat, flour to make it stick to the ribs. Meat steps forward, sturdy and honest. Fat is no vice, it is a promise. Dried strips crackle in the pot, rehydrating with a patience encouraged by low flame and talk paired to essentials. No one lets a bowl go cold. There is less ceremony and, somehow, more meaning. A host who chooses to slaughter in winter for a guest declares himself without speeches. I had this, and now you have some of it, and that makes us, for this day, the same. The wind bangs the door and conversation pauses until the flap settles. A dog sighs in his sleep. Someone adds fuel to the coals not by habit, but as a ward against the dark. If a drum beats anywhere on the step, it is the heart, steadying itself. Spring is a negotiation. The land loosens but grudgingly. Supplies run low and hope has not yet become abundance. A stranger will still be welcomed with tea and bread, but the bread may be thin, the butter scraped from the corners of the wooden tub. Fresh milk returns like a rumor, then a fact. The first bowl feels like absolution. Hospitality in the spring is careful, but not stingy. Generosity is measured by steadiness, not spectacle. A wise guest reads the table and matches his appetite to it. A wise host admits limits without apology. Both leave the exchange with pride intact, which is as important to a survival as the calories. The calendar also governs pace. In summer, visits sprawl. Rides are long because daylight is cheap. In winter, the clock is the stove. A man arrives at noon because to ride at dusk is a kind of dare, and he leaves in time to count the landmarks home before the sky closes. Hosts, too, marshal their hours differently. Summer lets them linger at the doorway, gossip with a hand on the horse's shoulder, send a child to fetch a neighbor who knows an envoy's cousin. Winter keeps them inside. The ritual abbreviates, but it does not fray. Bowls still arrive with two hands. The honored place remains the north. A small joke still patches a small mistake. Courtesy does its work even when there is frost on the rim. Ceremony itself breathes with the weather. The Nadam months when the grass is bold and the horses sleek thread. Hospitality with spectacle. Wrestlers in open fields slap their thighs and bow like hawks. The winner takes a sip and hands the bowl to the elder who will live longest in the stories. Guests become audiences, and then, with a nod, participants. A passing envoy is asked to judge a sprint or offer a blessing before a boy's first public bout. These invitations are not trivial. To include a stranger in joy is to bind him more tightly than you could with argument. Later, when the gur grows loud and meat arrives balanced on knives, someone will pour from a higher bowl with 2 hands. The envoy will drink carefully and, in doing so, announce to himself that he remembers the face that served him. Seasons carry their own rules of thrift and display. A poor household that sets out fresh cheese in late spring is telling you something about the health of its mares. A rich one that passes only dried curd in autumn is telling you something to stinginess that the estate notices and punishes in the coin of reputation. The code is not a ledger, but it feels like one. A traveler learns to read subtleties, the thickness of a blanket offered at night, the freshness of the rushes underfoot, whether the children watch him warily or with frank, untroubled curiosity. He tucks these readings away with the map in his head because he will need them when he decides where to sleep if the road goes wrong next month. Practicalities shoulder through romance. Food doesn't walk into a pot by itself. Women's labor braiding curds on ropes hung under the smoke hole, turning milk that sours if the sun gets a temper, keeping yeast alive in a climate that forgets to be gentle, underwrites the poetry everyone prefers to remember. Men's labor dragging ice, cutting meat with hands that learned from their fathers, where tendons give and where they refuse keeps the narrative honest. Hospitality is not a performance for strangers. It is a muscle built by repetition for the sake of the household itself. The guest benefits because the practice exists, not the other way around. The seasons also decide punishment. To send a man away hungry in summer will stain your name. To do it in winter can make you a legend for the wrong reasons. Stories travel faster when the grass is green, but they stick hard when snow makes the world small. A careless breach of etiquette in July can be laughed off by an elder with a good line. In January, it hisses like a crack in a wall. Conversely, winter is generous with forgiveness when the intention is right. A stranger fumbles a taboo. The host corrects with a glance and a second chance, because no one behaves perfectly with hands stiff from cold. There is a modern temptation to measure these rituals by efficiency, to ask whether the time spent boiling, pouring, and blessing could be better used. The step answers with weather. Efficiency can get you across a valley. Custom can get you returned when the valley closes. A bowl of tea in winter has value beyond hydration. It tells a traveler that he is remembered by people who owe him nothing. That memory is the estate's true currency, and its mint works year-round. When a guest rides away in spring, the door flap falls and the gur breathes out. Someone laughs about the awkward way he held the bowl. Someone else notes that his saddle was good leather and that he looked at the horses as if counting. The host tucks a last piece of information away like a coal banked under ash. Summer will need that coal, and so will winter. The seasons keep their cycle. Hospitality keeps its own. The two feed each other, and between them a thin, fierce civilization persists. Bright as a stove on a moonless night. Drive east out of Ulaanbaatar, and the traffic thins to a thread. The city's glass and concrete fall away to brown, then green, then the pale blue of distance, a color that isn't a sky so much as the idea of it. Power lines keep you company for a while, then even they decide they have other places to be. What remains is the old itinerary: wind, dust, and the long strides of pasture and the rules that go with it. Modern Mongolia has cell towers, supermarkets, and late-night karaoke, but the code of welcome that once kept riders alive under an enormous sky didn't retire when the highways arrived. It simply learned new habits. A gur still looks like a promise from far off, low, white, and round against the grass, smoke thinning from the crown. The SUV idles where ponies once stood, but the choreography has not changed much. The door faces south. The host comes out to meet you, palm open, reading your face for weather and purpose. You are shown in and told where to sit. Honor still lies opposite the door, near the family altar and the best blankets. A bowl arrives in 2 hands. It may be arag in summer, sour and bright, or suute, tosai, the salted milk tea that powers conversations and mercy when the wind has teeth. Bread follows, fried bortsog is stacked like small pillows, and then curds, then meat according to season and means. No one mentions money. No one needs to. City people know the code as well. The gur districts that ring Ulaanbaatar, neighborhoods of felt roofs, wood stoves, and satellite dishes are proof that nomadism can live on a street map. Here, too, a stranger's knock will fetch a kettle to the boil. Hospitality survives because it makes sense. It is etiquette tuned for a place where plans change with the weather report, and the weather reports are suggestions. A late snow or a dust storm can strand the unprepared. A broken fan belt is as decisive as a broken stirrup. In such a landscape, the quickest insurance policy is a memory: they helped me once. I will help them now. Tourists come for the horizon and find themselves folded into this ordinary generosity. Cyclists roll in pink with dust and sit blinking at a low table while a grandmother presses a second piece of bread into their hands with the same firmness she would use on a backsliding grandson. Photographers go hunting for authenticity and are puzzled to find it wearing a Manchester United jersey, ladling soup with one hand while silencing a ringtone with the other. A well-traveled guest may arrive with small offerings: tea bricks, sweets for the children, a scarf for the elder. These are not payments, they are acknowledgments. A way of saying, I see the work behind this bowl and I honor it. The old taboos still fence the room in a pattern of respect. You do not step on the threshold. You do not point your feet at the hearth. You accept with your right hand or with both, and you do not refuse the first offering unless you absolutely must. The stove remains the household's heart, whether it is fed with dried dung, coal, or split wood. No one pokes at it without leave. Children learn these rules as early as they learn to hold a cup. City schools teach civics. Family rooms teach survival. Change, when it comes, has a way of wearing tradition rather than pitting itself against it. Motorbikes have joined horses in the yard, and aluminum kettles share shelf space with thermoses stamped with cartoon bears. Solar panels blink where last year the lamp burned kerosene. A message in a family chat makes its own kind of smoke signal, and yet the first thing a host does is still to pour, to offer warmth in liquid form and then in words, to make space. Roads link imogs more quickly now. Nadam festivals sell branded caps alongside the sacred trio of wrestling, archery, and horse racing. But the tent that shelters the judge and the tent that welcomes a passerby share the same grammar. Sit, drink, tell us where you came from, stay until you are yourself again. The code is not nostalgia. It remains a discipline sharpened by hard years. Adzud, the deep winter disaster of ice and hunger, still stalks the news and the pasture. When it hits, herds thin in a week to bones and sorrow. In those years, the open door is not courtesy, it is obligation, and reputations are made or broken on whether a family can feed one more mouth. That is why the stories the ones travelers carry back to town, the ones herders trade at wells, still carry so much weight. A house that turned someone away in January will discover in July that no one has time to help them pull a stuck truck free. Praise circulates just as efficiently. Stop there. One rider will tell another, "They saved me in a storm." The estate posts road signs now, and weather forecasts can beat a cloud to your camp. But the oldest navigation remains social. An oil drum placed upright by a track may mean water here as surely as any app. A tethered dog with a bowl outside says someone is home. Families flag their gers with details the estep knows, how to read a horse line, tightly pegged signals. They are gone only a little while. A saddle on the ground, not the rack, says we arrived in a hurry. To a stranger, these are scenery. To those who live here, they are sentences. And the verbs are always come in and be well. Religions overlap easily with the code. A Buddhist prayer flag snaps near the door, its colors softened by dust. A shaman's drum kept out of sunlight rests under a cloth. A blue kadag scarf hangs above the family altar beside a framed diploma and a photo from a child's first wrestling win. Invoking Tengri, the eternal blue sky is as natural as checking the cloud bank. The welcome itself is older than any single creed and comfortably shelters all of them. You bless a guest in the way you have been blessed with food, with warmth, with listening. There is a business version of this hospitality now. Guest Gore camps out on the step, advertise hot showers, and city cafes plate bortsog into neat fans beside lattes. Tour companies fold the rituals into itineraries. Some of it is faintly theatrical, a courtesy taught quickly for the sake of visitors who will be gone by Monday. But even that performance relies on muscle memory. The actors grew up inside the real thing. If anything, the commercial echo preserves gestures that might otherwise thin under distance. A young host who practices pouring tea for strangers on the job is better at pouring it for kin when he goes home. What never feels staged is the quiet calculation that undergirds every act of generosity. A good host thinks ahead not only to the next visit, but to the next winter. They measure, they share, they set aside, and most importantly, they notice. To be seen on the step is to be safer. A boy who competes in horse racing today will be a man who remembers who gave him water when he was 9 and trembling from exertion. An old woman who takes your hand at the threshold now will have her name repeated into other kitchens next year when you look for a place to sleep. When people say the tradition endures, they often mean it survived time. More accurately, it survives usefulness. As long as distance exists and weather decides things and humans are born needing one another, the bowl will be offered and accepted. A stranger becomes a guest. A guest becomes a story. And stories in this country are currency that never devalues. Under neon or under moonlight, the exchange is the same. Come in, warm yourself, tell us who sent you, eat, rest. Remember us when the road looks like a mistake. From a distance, the code looks simple. A door faces south. A host steps out with an open hand. A bowl is offered and taken. Yet inside those small gestures lies a system that outlived empires and that still explains why a stranger can come in from the wind and sit in the warmest place in the room. It is tempting to call it kindness and leave it there. The old writers of the steppe chose another word, necessity. Hospitality was a technology long before writing fixed laws on paper, a way to make survival collaborative in a land where weather could reverse a life in an afternoon. Consider the places where the code is strongest. They are not the gentle ones. The steppe can be generous, yes, but its moods swing quickly. Grass that promised fat foals in June hides nothing in January. In such conditions, a traveler without shelter is an emergency that has simply not happened yet. The welcome anticipates that fact. To pour tea for the unexpected guest today is to help your future self years from now, when your horse founders at dusk and only a distant light answers. The ledger for such exchanges is not bound in leather. It is kept in memory and reputation. Writers mapped the steppe with stories: who helped whom in a storm, who lent a rope at the river, who refused to share fire. A family's good name rode farther than its strongest stallion, and the worst sentence you could pass on a household was not exile, but forgetfulness. The ger without a reputation is the most fragile structure on the plain. Because it carried survival, hospitality learned to carry politics as well. We have watched it working in the Chronicles feasts that soften a treaty's edges, cups refilled until caution lowers its shoulders, meat served lavishly as a promise of abundance to come. Not every alliance signed in soup held, but enough did that the ritual became its own kind of guarantee. The host, who can feed and protect a guest today, can feed and protect warriors tomorrow. Under this sky, strength is measured less in walls than in tables. Religion poured easily into that bowl without spilling the older meaning: a blue scarf at the altar, a prayer to the eternal sky, a monk's blessing. None of them contradicted the rule that a traveler must not be left outside. The god names changed, the stove's law did not. Even as power shifted from khans to commissars to cabinets, the fire remained the one authority everyone could acknowledge without speech. No one lets it die while a guest is in the room. We have traced the choreography to the south-facing door, the honored seat opposite, the two-handed offering, the prohibition against pointing your feet toward the fire, the careful setting down of a knife. These are not quaint flourishes for tourists, but instructions for how to make trust briefly possible among people who may never see one another again. For a few hours, a stranger becomes an obligation, then a memory. Seasons test the code and prove it. In summer, the welcome tastes of sour milk and green grass. In autumn, it thickens into slow-cooked meat. And talk about winter. In winter, it keeps people alive. In spring, it becomes modest, careful, a promise to do better when the foals stand again. This is ethics with a calendar. Hospitality changes its menu, but never its mood. Modern life did not abolish that answer. It gave it new tools. A family can warn a guest of a sudden storm by text, set a solar panel to charge a phone as conscientiously as they once dried dung for a stove, and send a location pin instead of a boy on a pony. But when the visitor arrives, the phone goes on the chest, the kettle goes on the fire, and the old order resumes. Old rules survive when they still solve present problems. What happens in that room, the room of felt and timber or brick and wallpaper, is small and practical. Someone takes your coat. Someone pours. Someone asks where you have come from and where you are going. You feel steadier not because the tea is strong, but because you have been seen and counted. You belong for the length of a bowl. The code has its limits, and acknowledging them honors it. Hosts cannot pour what they do not have, and a scarcity frays the most generous intent. There are houses that fail their own reputation, and there are guests who forget the difference between open door and open purse. But even the exceptions confirm the rule, because everyone can name the places where the welcome broke and why, and those names acquire the weight of warnings. A society that judges harshly those who refuse the fire is a society that keeps the fire alive. So the door still faces south, the bowl still comes in two hands, the guest still sets weapon and worry where both can be seen. The conversation starts with weather and moves, if trust permits, to news, horses, prices, children. Night falls, stories lengthen into thread, and the next morning, as the guest tightens girth or checks the tires, the host adds a closing to the ritual directions. Keep the ridge until you see the stand of larch. Take the left track where the ground whitens with assault. Stand outside afterward when the engine has dwindled to a point or the hoofbeats have thinned into the grass, and the logic of it becomes plain. Under a sky this wide, any virtue that does not learn to be useful will be worn away by the wind. Hospitality endures because it works. It shortens distance, mends chance, and turns solitude into a pause instead of a verdict. Somewhere out there, another door is opening. Somewhere a kettle lifts, and someone reaches for a bowl that has passed through more hands than any ledger could record. The code will hold because it is older than any story we tell about it, and yet it keeps making new ones. Tonight's guest is tomorrow's witness. Tomorrow's witness will be next year's host. And if, on some future evening, you should find yourself knocking under a sky that looks larger than courage, remember the grammar of this place. Face the door that faces the sun. Step carefully over the threshold. Offer your name like water. Take the bowl with both hands. Drink. You have joined a history that keeps its people alive.